There is a city beneath the city you think you know. Not a sewer system, not a network of tunnels, not the ordinary underground machinery that keeps a modern metropolis breathing. Something older. Something that was not merely built underground but was placed there, sealed, and in many cases deliberately hidden from the record. London, the city above, is one of the most studied, most documented, most obsessively mapped places in the entire human world. Historians have devoted careers to its streets. Archaeologists have written volumes about its foundations. And yet, beneath the pavements of Kensington and Aldgate and Southwark and the Strand, there are structures that do not appear in any official survey. Chambers that predate the Romans. Passageways that run for hundreds of meters and then simply stop, sealed with stone that was clearly meant never to be opened again. Rooms that workers broke into during the Blitz and quietly filled back in because what they found inside made the supervisors uncomfortable enough to file no report at all. This is not a fringe theory. This is what the archaeology actually shows when you start pulling the threads. If you are watching this to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where you are right now and what time it is. London is built on secrets. That is not a metaphor. It is the literal geological and historical condition of the place. Every time construction crews break ground anywhere within the old Roman boundary, they find things. Roman tessellated floors, yes. Medieval foundations, of course. But also things that have no clean explanation. Things that archaeologists photograph and catalogue, and then, frequently, say very little about in public. There is a reason the Museum of London has a category in its internal records described simply as anomalous subterranean finds. There is a reason that certain sections of the Thames foreshore are restricted to licensed detectorists with approved permits, not because of what has already been found there, but because of what authorities suspect is still down there, waiting. The story of what lies beneath London is not one story. It is dozens of stories layered on top of each other, like the city itself, each era pressing down on what came before, each civilization building its roads and walls and temples directly over the remains of whoever was there first. And the question that keeps surfacing, the question that archaeologists hedge around in careful academic language, while independent researchers ask it bluntly, is this: who was there first? Not the Romans, not the Celts, someone else, something else. A presence so old that by the time the Romans arrived in 43 AD and began their extraordinarily thorough process of documentation, even they seemed to know they were building on top of something they did not entirely understand. We are going to follow this question all the way down, through Roman London, through the pre-Roman settlements, through the layers of chalk and clay and gravel that lie beneath the familiar city, and into the parts of the record that nobody talks about on guided tours. We are going to look at the sealed chambers under Southwark Cathedral and what they actually contain. We are going to examine the section of tunnel discovered during the Jubilee Line extension in the 1990s that was quietly rerouted around rather than through. We are going to talk about the medieval records that describe a city beneath the city in language so specific it cannot be dismissed as superstition. And we are going to ask the question that all of this evidence eventually forces you to ask. Was London not founded by the Romans, not founded by the Celts, but instead inherited by both of them from something so much older that the word ancient barely covers it? Start with the ground itself. London sits on a series of gravel terraces above the Thames, and those terraces hold within them an extraordinarily long record of human presence. The earliest confirmed evidence of human activity in the London area dates to approximately 450,000 years ago. Not 4,500, not 45,000, 450,000 years. At Swanscombe, in Kent, just downstream from the city, archaeologists found skull fragments belonging to a human ancestor who sat by the Thames and made tools from flint with a sophistication that startled researchers when it was first excavated in the 1930s. The Swanscombe skull, as it became known, belonged to a creature who was neither fully Neanderthal nor fully modern human but something in between, something that looked at the wide river estuary and decided this was a place worth staying. By the time we reach 100,000 years ago, the Thames Valley was periodically occupied by groups of archaic humans who left behind hearths and tools and, in several cases, evidence of structures, not grand architecture. but deliberate arrangements of stone and bone that suggest these people were not simply passing through, they were camping. They were returning to the same sites, season after season. They were treating the north bank of the river as a home territory. Then the ice came. Multiple glaciation events scoured the landscape, pushed populations south, buried everything under meters of frozen debris, and when the ice retreated, the landscape that emerged was not the same one that had existed before. The river had moved. The hills had shifted. The chalk ridges that define the topology of Greater London today were carved into their familiar shapes by meltwater channels that cut through the stone with extraordinary force. And when the first post-glacial humans began to return to the area, sometime around 12,000 to 15,000 years ago, they were walking into a landscape that already had a deep human history, even if they did not know it. What they would have found, if they had been able to look beneath their own feet, were the traces of that earlier occupation. Hearthstones pressed deep into the gravel, worked flint hidden under deposits of later material, and in a few locations, something that archaeologists have been very cautious about describing publicly, what appear to be deliberately modified caves in the chalk. Not natural formations, not random erosion patterns, passages that run horizontally into the chalk bedrock, with walls that show clear evidence of tool use. Marks left by something hard and sharp, working the stone in patterns that are too regular, too consistent, to be anything other than intentional. These chalk passages are one of the great open secrets of London archaeology. They are mentioned in passing in technical reports. They appear in footnotes. They show up in the internal documentation of organisations like Thames Water and Transport for London, described in the dry bureaucratic language of civil engineering as anomalous subsurface voids of unknown origin. But when you take all of those references, when you map them against each other, a pattern emerges. The passages are not random, they connect. They run roughly north to south, toward the river, and they cluster in specific areas of the city. Beneath what is now the City of London, the ancient Square Mile, beneath Southwark on the south bank, and most intriguingly, beneath the area around what is now Fleet Street, where the River Fleet once ran openly through a valley before it was buried under the expanding city. The River Fleet is its own story, and it is a story that matters enormously to what we are trying to understand. The Fleet was once a significant waterway, wide enough, in Roman times, for small boats to navigate, clean enough, in the medieval period, that its banks were desirable real estate. But the Fleet was progressively buried as London expanded, first covered over in its northern reaches during the 18th century, then bricked in along the Farringdon Road in the 19th century, until the entire river became essentially a covered sewer running beneath the street. When Victorian engineers were undertaking this burial process, they found things in the Fleet Valley that ended up in the same category of records as the chalk passages, quietly noted, minimally described, not publicised. One of those finds was a series of timber structures in the banks of the Fleet, at a depth that placed them well below the Roman occupation layer. These were not Roman. The timber species, the tool marks, the construction technique, all pointed to something pre-Roman by a substantial margin. Estimates based on the stratigraphy suggested they were at least 2,000 years old at the time of discovery, which would place them in the late Bronze Age or early Iron Age at the absolute latest. But the position of the timbers, the way they were arranged, suggested they had not been simple riverside structures. They formed something more like a deliberate architectural feature, a reinforced bank, a supported platform. Something built to last, built to withstand the force of the river, built by people who understood engineering in a way that our assumptions about Iron Age Britain do not comfortably accommodate. Here is where the story starts to become genuinely strange, because the timber structures in the Fleet Valley are not an isolated find. They correspond, geographically, with something that has been hiding in plain sight in the historical record for centuries. The Welsh text, known as the Brut y Brenhinedd, the Chronicle of the Kings, contains a description of a city called Troia Newid, New Troy. This is the legendary founding narrative of London, and it is usually dismissed by mainstream historians as medieval fantasy. The story goes that a Trojan hero named Brutus, a descendant of Aeneas, led a group of refugees to Britain, defeated the giants who inhabited the island, and founded a city on the north bank of the Thames that he called Troia Newid, in honour of the fallen city his ancestors had fled. This city, the Chronicle insists, was built on a site that was already special, already marked, already somehow prepared for habitation by whoever or whatever had been there before the Trojans arrived. Most historians treat this as mythology, and they are right to be cautious, because the Chronicle of the Kings is a medieval compilation with obvious legendary elements and no consistent historical reliability. But here is what is interesting. The specific detail about the site being already prepared, already marked, that detail appears across multiple independent sources. Geoffrey of Monmouth, writing in the 12th century, describes Brutus encountering evidence of previous habitation when he first explored the Thames Valley. He does not describe what this evidence was, but he notes it in language that suggests it was physical, visible, tangible. Not a legend about giants, but actual structures, actual signs of prior occupation. The giants of the Chronicle, the scholars who study this material most carefully have argued, may be a mythologized memory of a real earlier population. People who were larger in cultural memory than in physical stature because they had done something so impressive that it seemed impossible. They had built a city, or something very much like a city, in a place that later peoples would choose to build again and again and again. And the archaeology, when you examine it without the filter of mainstream assumptions about what pre-Roman Britain was capable of, starts to support this interpretation in ways that are difficult to explain away. The excavations at Heathrow in the 1940s, undertaken to prepare the site for the airport, uncovered a complex of wooden structures that archaeologists eventually dated to the Late Bronze Age, roughly 1000 to 800 BC. These structures were arranged around a central enclosure, with a precision that suggested not a random settlement but a planned layout. Streets, or at least trackways, running between buildings, evidence of specialized activity areas, places where metalworking happened, places where grain was stored, places where the material culture suggested something close to administration, close to the organized distribution of resources that we associate with urban rather than rural settlement. The site was remarkable. And then it was buried under concrete and tarmac as the airport was built, and most of the finds ended up in storage rather than public exhibition, and the significance of what had been discovered there has never been fully incorporated into the standard narrative of London's origins. Why not? That is the question that starts to nag at you once you begin looking at this material seriously. Why does the official story of London begin with the Romans, when the archaeological evidence clearly shows substantial, organized human settlement in the Thames Valley centuries and millennia before the Roman invasion? The standard answer is that pre-Roman settlement was not urban in any meaningful sense, that it was scattered farmsteads and tribal territories, not cities. But that answer is becoming harder to sustain with each new excavation. The site at Southwark, on the south bank of the Thames, has produced evidence of substantial pre-Roman occupation that includes not just structures, but what appears to be a road or causeway predating any known Roman construction. If there was a causeway across the Thames marshes before the Romans built their bridge, then someone built it. And whoever built it was not a scattered farmer living in a roundhouse. They were an engineer with resources and planning capability and a reason to create a permanent crossing at this specific point on the river. The Romans chose to build their bridge at almost exactly the same location. They named their city Londinium. But where did that name come from? This is another question that the standard account handles with less confidence than it pretends. The Roman name Londinium is almost universally agreed by linguists to be a Romanization of an existing name. The Romans did not invent the name, they adapted it. But from what? The Celtic derivation that most textbooks offer, from a word meaning something like wild or bold place, is linguistically contested. Other scholars have proposed that the name derives from a pre-Celtic substrate language, one of those ghost languages that existed in Britain before the Celtic migrations, and of which we have almost no direct evidence, only traces preserved in place names that do not respond cleanly to Celtic or Latin etymology. If London's name predates the Celts, then London as a named, identified, meaningful place predates the Celts. And the Celts arrived in Britain somewhere between 800 and 500 BC, which means we are looking at a place that was significant, that had a name, that was known and identified more than 2,500 years ago, at minimum, possibly much longer. The chalk. We keep coming back to the chalk, because the chalk is where the oldest physical evidence concentrates, and the chalk is where the sealed structures are. The chalk bedrock beneath central London sits at varying depths depending on location, but in the area of the City of London it is accessible from about 15 metres below street level, and in some areas less. The chalk was quarried extensively during the medieval period, and those medieval chalk mines are well documented. But beneath the medieval quarrying, there is older work, much older. The marks left by medieval quarrymen are characteristic and recognizable. Straight cuts, regular patterns, the signature of iron tools working quickly for a practical purpose. The marks in the deeper chalk are different, curved in some places, deliberately smoothed in others. In a handful of locations, patterned in ways that serve no quarrying purpose, but that parallel, with unsettling precision, the kinds of marks found in ritual or ceremonial contexts at other prehistoric sites across Britain and Europe. There is a chamber beneath the area of Cannon Street Station that has been known to London Underground engineers for decades. It was first encountered during the construction of the District Railway in the 1880s and was noted in the engineering records as a natural cavity of unusual dimensions. But subsequent examination, the kind that happens informally when workers find themselves standing inside something unexpected, revealed that the chamber was not natural. The walls were too regular. The floor had been levelled. There were features in the stone that looked like niches, deliberate recesses cut into the chalk at regular intervals around the chamber's perimeter. The chamber was sealed, a wall of mortared flint built across its entrance, and the railway was built around it. It is still there. It appears in maintenance records as a structural void to be monitored for movement. It has never been formally excavated. It has never been publicly reported as what it clearly is, which is a man-made underground chamber of unknown age and unknown purpose, directly beneath one of the busiest transport hubs in the world. The Cannon Street Chamber is not the only one. Let us be clear about that before we go any further, because one anomalous underground void can be explained away. Two is a coincidence. But when you start mapping the documented anomalous subterranean features of central London, when you pull together the engineering records and the archaeological footnotes and the unpublished survey data and the accounts that circulate among the people who actually work beneath the city, the number stops being manageable by coincidence. There are dozens of them. Chambers, passages, sealed galleries, blocked shafts. They cluster in the oldest parts of the city. They are concentrated in areas that correspond to the highest ground within the Roman boundary, the places that any early settlers would have chosen first. And they share certain characteristics that suggest not independent construction at different times, but a coherent, planned underground system built by people who knew what they were doing and who intended what they built to last. The most extensively documented of these features, documented in the sense that it has been written about by enough separate observers to be undeniable, is the complex beneath Southwark Cathedral. Southwark Cathedral sits on the south bank of the Thames, just beside London Bridge, and its history as a place of worship goes back at least to the 11th century AD. But beneath the Norman and Gothic fabric of the cathedral, beneath the Roman remains that have been excavated in the cathedral grounds, there is something older. The excavations of the 19th and early 20th centuries found Roman structures at the lower levels, as expected, but they also found, beneath the Roman floor levels, a series of chambers cut into the gravel and clay that predate any Roman construction. These chambers are not natural. They are too regular, too deliberate, and they contain something that the excavation reports of the period describe with striking vagueness as ritual deposits. Animal bones arranged in specific patterns, deposits of worked flint, and in one chamber, a series of carved stone objects that the report from 1840 describes as of unknown purpose and considerable antiquity. Those carved stone objects from the Southwark excavation are in the Museum of London's collection. They are not on public display. They are not featured in any of the museum's major exhibitions on prehistoric London. If you submit a request to examine them as a researcher, you will eventually be granted access, and what you will find is a group of roughly a dozen carved chalk objects, the largest about 30 centimetres across, bearing geometric designs of a type that appears across prehistoric European cultures in a range from the Neolithic period onward. Spirals, concentric circles, the cup and ring marks that show up on standing stones across Britain and Ireland and Brittany. These objects were found in a chamber beneath a cathedral on the south bank of the Thames under Roman stratigraphy, meaning they were placed there before the Romans arrived. Before Julius Caesar made his exploratory raids on Britain in 55 and 54 BC, before any recorded contact between Rome and this island, in a deliberate, sealed underground space, arranged in a way that the excavators of 1840 recognized as intentional, even if they could not explain it. What were they for? The honest answer is that we do not know. But we can observe that similar objects, similarly placed in underground contexts, appear at other sites across prehistoric Britain. At Newgrange in Ireland, carved stone basins sit in the inner chambers of the Great Passage tomb, positioned to receive the bones of the dead. At Maes Howe, in Orkney, carved geometric designs decorate the walls of a chamber that was sealed for thousands of years before Viking raiders broke in during the 12th century and carved their own graffiti over the prehistoric work. The pattern of carving, sealing, and underground placement is not unique to London. It is part of a much wider prehistoric tradition, a tradition of treating the underground as a space set apart, as a space with specific ritual or cosmological significance, as a space that required certain objects and certain arrangements and then required to be closed. When you place the Southwark chalk objects within that wider tradition, they stop looking like inexplicable anomalies and start looking like exactly what they probably are, the remnants of a prehistoric ritual tradition that treated the ground beneath the Thames as sacred, that built chambers beneath the surface, not for storage or shelter, but for ceremony, that placed carved objects in those chambers with deliberate care and then sealed them in, not to hide them from enemies, but to preserve them in a particular relationship with the earth. This is not fringe archaeology. This is what the comparative material culture actually suggests. It is just that nobody has stood up at a mainstream conference and said it plainly, because saying it plainly requires acknowledging that the people who built these chambers beneath what is now Southwark Cathedral had a sophisticated and organized relationship with this site. Centuries before any civilization we conventionally credit with sophistication reached these shores. Let us talk about the Romans, because the Romans are the starting point for every official account of London's history, and the Romans are also the source of some of the most interesting evidence for what existed here before them. The Roman city of Londinium was established around 47 to 50 AD, roughly 4 years after the Claudian invasion. It was built quickly, efficiently, in the Roman manner, and it was designed from the beginning as a commercial hub rather than a military centre, which tells us something important. The Romans built their fort, Cripplegate, on the northern edge of what became the city, but the city itself was organized around trade, around the river, around a bridge that gave access to the road network spreading out across the newly conquered province. The site was chosen for practical reasons. The gravel terraces provided good drainage, the river provided transport and commerce. The existing population centres in the surrounding area provided a market. But here is what the Roman sources themselves admit, in the careful, sideways way that Roman writers sometimes acknowledge things that do not fit comfortably into the narrative of Roman superiority. The site of Londinium was not empty when the Romans arrived. There was already a crossing point on the Thames. There were already trackways leading to it. There were already, in several locations within what became the Roman city, structures that the Romans did not build and that they chose to incorporate rather than demolish. The Romans were pragmatic about existing sacred sites. Their standard practice in conquered territories was to acknowledge local religious sites, often to conflate local gods with Roman ones, and to build their own temples in proximity to existing sacred locations rather than on top of them. When you map the distribution of Roman temples in Londinium against the distribution of the anomalous pre-Roman features, they match. The Romans built their temples where the pre-Roman sacred sites were, which means they knew the pre-Roman sacred sites were there, which means those sites were visible, known, and significant enough to influence the placement of Roman religious architecture. The Temple of Mithras is the most famous example of a Roman sacred site in London. It was discovered in 1954 during construction work on Queen Victoria Street in the City of London, and its discovery became something of a national event. The Walbrook Mithraeum, as it is now known, was a rectangular temple dedicated to the mystery cult of Mithras, used probably from the late 2nd to the early 4th century AD. It was excavated, partially, amid the bomb damage and construction chaos of post-war London and the sculptures found within it, including a remarkable marble head of Mithras are now in the London Mithraeum reconstructed in the Bloomberg Building's basement. But what the popular account of the Mithraeum discovery almost always omits is what was found beneath the Roman temple, beneath the Roman floor levels, beneath the Roman foundations, in the dark mud of the Walbrook stream valley. The excavators of 1954 found evidence of pre-Roman activity at the site. The Walbrook, like the Fleet, was a London river that was buried as the city expanded, running roughly north to south through the City of London before discharging into the Thames. It was a significant waterway in the Roman period, and it had been significant before the Romans arrived. The finds from the Walbrook Valley include an extraordinary quantity of human skulls. This is well documented in the archaeological literature, though again it is not the kind of thing that features prominently in popular histories of Roman London. Hundreds of human skulls have been recovered from the Walbrook over the decades since the 19th century, when drainage and construction work first began disturbing the river sediments. The skulls are predominantly male, predominantly young adult, and they show no evidence of the kind of burial practices associated with either Roman or known pre-Roman British traditions. They were not in graves. They were not associated with other skeletal remains. They were simply in the river, concentrated in the valley, in numbers that cannot be explained by accidental drowning or flood deposition. The current mainstream view is that they represent the victims of conflict, possibly heads taken in battle and deposited in the river as trophies or offerings. The pre-Roman Celts did practice head-taking, but the concentration and number of these skulls, and the fact that they cluster around the area of the Walbrook Valley rather than being distributed along the river's entire length, suggests something more deliberate, something more organized, a specific site, used for a specific purpose, over a substantial period of time. The Romans built the Mithraeum directly beside the Walbrook, on the edge of the valley where the skulls were concentrated. They chose that specific location, in a city where they had considerable choice of sites, to build one of their most significant religious structures. And Mithraism was not a casual cult. It was a mystery religion, with multiple grades of initiation, with secret rites that were never written down for outsiders, with a cosmology that involved the fundamental forces of creation and destruction. The Romans did not build their Mithraeum beside the skull-filled Walbrook by accident. They built it there because they recognized the Walbrook Valley as a place that was already sacred, already marked by the kind of activities that Mithraism also engaged with, already understood by the existing population as a threshold between the ordinary world and something else. And beneath the Mithraeum, beneath the Roman layers, there are those pre-Roman features, timber structures, worked deposits, evidence of deliberate, organized activity in a location that the Roman sacred geography of Londinium then enclosed and built upon. The story tells itself, if you are willing to read it. The Romans did not create sacred London, they inherited it. Now, let us go further back, because the Bronze Age and Iron Age evidence is striking. But there is evidence that is older still, and it points towards something that the conventional history of London has enormous difficulty accommodating. The Thames is one of the great, ancient rivers of Europe. It has been flowing, in broadly its current course, for several 100,000 years. It was a migration route for animals and for the human populations that followed them. And like all great rivers, it was a place where objects were deposited deliberately by the people who lived along its banks. The Thames has been producing extraordinary finds for centuries, many of them weapons and personal ornaments thrown or placed into the water as offerings. But among those finds are a small number of objects that do not fit the expected typology of any known period. There are carved stone objects from the Thames foreshore that bear geometric designs of the type we associate with the Neolithic period, which in Britain runs from roughly 4000 to 2500 BC. Their presence in the river suggests deliberate deposition, the same kind of offering that people were making to the Thames with metal weapons throughout the Bronze and Iron Ages. But they predate the Bronze Age by a millennium or more. And they connect, conceptually and stylistically, to the chalk objects found in the Southwark chambers, which connect in turn to the chalk passages beneath the city, which connect to the idea of a deliberate, organized, long-established sacred landscape centered on this specific bend in the Thames. You are looking at a tradition that stretches back at least 5,000 years, possibly 6, possibly more. A tradition of treating this particular place, this curve in the river, this gravel terrace above the floodplain, as significant, as sacred, as a place where the boundary between the ordinary world and whatever lay beyond it was thin. And that tradition left physical traces, underground traces, sealed traces that have been accumulating beneath the city ever since. Every new layer of occupation sealed the previous one. The Romans sealed the prehistoric. The medieval sealed the Roman. The Georgian and Victorian and modern city sealed all of it. And what is down there, in the chalk, in the river mud, in the sealed chambers, under the railway stations and the cathedrals, is not gone. It is just waiting to be read. The sealed city beneath London is not one thing. It is a palimpsest. A document written and overwritten again, each layer partially obscuring the one below, but never entirely erasing it. To understand it, you have to read all the layers simultaneously, which is what good archaeology actually does, and which is why the story that good archaeology tells about London is so much more complicated and so much more interesting than the standard account that starts with the Romans and treats everything before as a vague and primitive prelude. Let us spend some time with the medieval period, because the medieval Londoners knew things that we have largely forgotten. They lived much closer to the ground than we do, in every sense. They dug wells and cesspits and foundations and cellars, and they were constantly breaking through into earlier periods of the city's history, and they kept records of what they found. Not systematic archaeological records, obviously, but chronicles, legal documents, ecclesiastical records, and architectural surveys that mention, in passing, what was underneath the city, in a way that suggests medieval Londoners had a matter-of-fact relationship with the underground antiquity of their home that we have lost. There are entries in the London city records from the 13th and 14th centuries that describe workers breaking into vaulted chambers while digging foundations. These entries do not treat this as remarkable. They treat it as a nuisance, as a structural problem to be solved by filling the chamber and continuing construction. But sometimes they describe what was in the chamber before it was filled, and those descriptions are worth paying attention to. One entry from 1248 in the records of the building works at St. Paul's Cathedral mentions that workers digging foundation trenches broke through into a vaulted space that contained, in the words of the clerk who recorded it, ancient carved stones of great size and certain vessels of a material unknown to the workmen. The vessels were taken away, presumably for examination, and do not appear again in any surviving record. The carved stones were too heavy to move easily and were buried beneath the new foundation. They are presumably still there, beneath the floor of the cathedral, sealed under 8 centuries of subsequent construction. What were they? The description, ancient carved stones and unknown vessels in a vaulted underground chamber, could fit any number of scenarios. But the combination of elements, the deliberate construction of the vault, the presence of carved objects and containers, the location beneath what was already an ancient sacred site in 1248, points toward exactly the kind of prehistoric ritual context that the Southwark material represents. The medieval Londoners were not the first people to build a cathedral on that hill. They were just the most recent in a very long series of people who had recognized that Ludgate Hill was special and had built something on it to mark that recognition. There is a theory, and it is one that a growing number of serious researchers are taking seriously, that Ludgate Hill was the location of an ancient sacred site that predates any known British civilization by thousands of years. The hill sits at the western end of what became the Roman city, directly above the Fleet Valley, at the point where the river and the hill and the road all converge. It commands the approach from the west. It overlooks the river. It is, from a purely practical standpoint, exactly where you would place the most important structure in any settlement at this location. And the evidence from the multiple building phases at St. Paul's Cathedral, which has been rebuilt on this site at least 4 times in recorded history, suggests that each successive structure was built with awareness of what had come before, not always understanding it, but acknowledging its presence. The fire of 1666, the Great Fire of London, destroyed the medieval St. Paul's and led to Wren's rebuilding of the cathedral in the years that followed. During the clearance of the fire damage and the preparation of the site for new construction, workers found things. John Aubrey, the antiquarian who was alive at the time and who had a particular interest in prehistoric remains, recorded several accounts of finds made during this work, including what he described as the foundations of a Roman temple and, below those, what he called a more ancient work of a nature he could not determine. Aubrey was not a fantasist. He was a careful observer who was one of the first people in England to systematically study prehistoric monuments. His account of finds at St. Paul's during the rebuilding corresponds with what the archaeology of the site would predict, a Roman religious structure overlying a pre-Roman sacred site. But the scale and nature of the pre-Roman work, which Aubrey admitted he could not determine, has never been established by proper excavation, because every time anyone has had the opportunity to excavate beneath St. Paul's, the priority has been the known historic remains, rather than the deeper, stranger, older material. The deeper, stranger, older material. That is what this is really about. Not the Roman city, fascinating as it is. Not the medieval city, rich as its underground archaeology is. But the thing that was here before all of that. The thing that caused every subsequent civilization to build in the same places, to treat the same hills and valleys and river crossings as sacred, to dig into the ground and place objects there and seal the chambers. The thing that gives London its peculiar, insistent quality of ancientness. The feeling that sits in your chest when you walk through certain parts of the old city. The feeling that something happened here, long before anyone who left records. Something that still reverberates in the geography of the place. That feeling is not imagination. It is a response to real material evidence of a real presence. The sealed city beneath London is the physical record of that presence. And the more carefully you look at it, the clearer it becomes that what was sealed beneath the streets was not sealed by accident or by the ordinary processes of urban growth, but in many cases deliberately, intentionally sealed by people who understood that what was down there mattered, and who made the decision, for whatever reason, that it should not be seen. Why would someone seal an underground chamber deliberately? Not fill it accidentally with rubble as buildings collapsed, not bury it under the gradual accumulation of new construction, but seal it, build a wall across its entrance, close it with intention. That question sits at the center of the London mystery, and it does not have a simple answer. But it has several possible answers, and all of them are more interesting than the assumption that what lies beneath the city is just debris. The first possibility is preservation. Sealing is a way of protecting something you consider valuable but cannot or should not keep above ground. The religious traditions of prehistoric Britain, as we understand them from the material evidence, placed enormous importance on the underground as a space for things that needed to be kept. The dead were buried, offerings were deposited, sacred objects were placed in the earth with deliberate care. Sealing an underground space with its contents intact would be entirely consistent with a tradition that understood the earth as a keeper, a preserver, a place where things could be held in a kind of suspended state between the ordinary world and whatever lay beyond it. The second possibility is concealment. At some point in the history of the site, someone wanted what was underground to be invisible, not accessible, not findable by the wrong people. The history of Britain from the 1st century AD onward is a history of the aggressive suppression of indigenous religious practice. The Romans did not, contrary to popular belief, always tolerate local religions. Their war against the Druids, culminating in the massacre at Anglesey in 60 AD, was specifically targeted at the intellectual and religious leadership of British Celtic society, because the Romans understood that, as long as the Druids existed, and as long as the sacred sites remained accessible, resistance to Roman rule would have a spiritual and ideological framework from which to operate. Sealing underground sacred sites would have been an entirely rational response to Roman conquest. Hide what cannot be defended, preserve what cannot be displayed, keep the knowledge underground, literally and figuratively, until conditions changed. The third possibility is that the sealing was the point, that what was placed in those underground chambers was not meant to be retrieved, but was meant to stay there. That the act of closing the chamber was itself the ritual act, the final gesture of a ceremony that required the permanent entombment of whatever was within. This is not as strange as it sounds. There are examples from across prehistoric Europe of deliberate closure of sacred sites, sites that were used for generations and then sealed with the same deliberation that was applied to their construction. Newgrange in Ireland was sealed, its entrance blocked, after its period of active use ended. The passage tombs of Brittany were similarly closed. The henges and stone circles of Britain show evidence in several cases of deliberate decommissioning, of the removal or toppling of stones in a way that suggests not destruction by enemies, but closure by the communities that had built them. The underground chambers of London may have been sealed in exactly this spirit, not hidden from enemies, not abandoned carelessly, closed with intention, by the people who built them, at the end of whatever their active use required. Any of these three explanations, or some combination of all three, would account for what the archaeology shows. What none of them require is that what was sealed was insignificant. You do not go to the trouble of building a flint wall across a chalk passage, or constructing a mortared seal across a vaulted chamber if what is inside does not matter to you. The effort of sealing implies the importance of what is sealed. And the consistency of the sealing across multiple sites, the fact that chamber after chamber has been found closed rather than open, suggests that this was not individual decision-making but organized, coordinated action by a community that agreed on what needed to be done. There is a third site that needs to be examined in detail, and it is in some ways the most compelling of all, because it sits at the intersection of the historical record and the physical evidence in a way that makes the whole pattern visible. It is the area around Billingsgate, the ancient fish market at the northern end of the old London Bridge on the north bank of the Thames. Billingsgate has been a market site since at least the 10th century AD, probably earlier. The name itself is pre-Norman, suggesting a Saxon origin, and the site has been associated with trade and commercial activity for as long as there is any documentary record. But beneath the medieval and Roman occupation levels at Billingsgate, archaeologists have found a sequence of structures that tells a story the standard account of London's origins cannot easily absorb. The deepest structures at Billingsgate, the ones that predate the Roman conquest, appear to be associated with the river crossing. Not the Roman bridge, which was slightly to the west, but an earlier crossing, one that the Romans apparently found already in use when they arrived, and which influenced their decision to build their own bridge where they did. This earlier crossing, whatever form it took, was not simply a ford. The evidence suggests some form of deliberate structure, almost certainly timber, associated with elaborate deposits in the river on both banks. The deposits are the kind of thing that archaeologists call structured deposition, meaning objects placed in the water at specific points, in specific arrangements, in patterns that are too regular to be accidental. Weapons, personal ornaments, ceramic vessels, and at Billingsgate specifically, the excavation reports from the various phases of investigation since the Victorian period mention deposits of worked bone and carved stone that match, in type if not in precise form, the objects from the Southwark chambers. What the Billingsgate evidence suggests is a crossing point that was sacred as well as practical, a place where the river was crossed and where, as part of the crossing, offerings were made. This is not a uniquely British practice. Sacred river crossings are documented across prehistoric Europe, and the pattern of offering deposition at crossing points is one of the most consistent features of the archaeological record from the Bronze Age through the Iron Age. But the Billingsgate deposits appear to predate the Iron Age. The deepest levels of the structured deposition sequence at Billingsgate have been tentatively dated, on the basis of the object types and the stratigraphy, to the mid to late Bronze Age, roughly 1200 to 800 BC. And the sequence appears to continue without interruption from that point, through the Roman period, suggesting that the practice of depositing objects at this river crossing was maintained across the Celtic and then the Roman periods, not introduced by either of them, but inherited from whatever came before. Inherited. That word keeps appearing in this story. The Romans inherited the crossing point. The Romans inherited the sacred landscape of the Walbrook. The medieval builders inherited the hills and the fundamental geography of the city. The Saxons, who gave Billingsgate its name, inherited the market site that had been in continuous use since before the Romans arrived. London is not, in any meaningful sense, a Roman invention. It is an inheritance. Each layer of the city inherited something from the layer below, and the layer below inherited it from the one below that, all the way down to the people who first looked at this bend in the river, this confluence of streams and terraces and chalk ridges, and decided that it was the right place to do whatever needed doing. Whoever those people were, they were the real founders of London, and they are the ones who built what lies beneath. The question of who they were is one that mainstream archaeology approaches very carefully. The standard framework for British prehistory distinguishes between the Mesolithic period, roughly 10,000 to 4,000 BC, characterized by hunter-gatherer populations, and the Neolithic period, roughly 4000 to 2500 BC, characterized by the introduction of farming and the construction of monumental structures. The great megalithic traditions, the long barrows, the stone circles, the passage tombs, belong to the Neolithic and the subsequent Bronze Age. And most archaeological thought about organized, large-scale activity in the London area places it in the Neolithic period at the earliest, in the context of the monument-building cultures that were active across southern Britain from around 3500 BC. But there are finds from the London area that push against this framework in ways that are difficult to accommodate. The worked chalk from below the Roman levels at various sites across the city includes pieces that, when examined by specialists in prehistoric lithics, do not fit comfortably into the known typological sequences for the Neolithic or early Bronze Age. They are unusual enough that several specialists have suggested they represent a distinct regional tradition that either predates the known sequence or runs parallel to it, a local practice that does not neatly correspond to the national picture. This is cautious academic language for something more significant. These objects may represent a tradition of chalk working in the London area that is genuinely old, older than the conventional Neolithic in this region, older than anything that the current framework for British prehistory has a clear place for. The Mesolithic in Britain is a period that we know existed but know very little about in detail, particularly in the London area. The landscape of the early Holocene, the period after the last ice age ended around 11,700 years ago, was very different from the landscape we know today. Britain was still connected to the continent by Doggerland, the great landmass that now lies beneath the North Sea, and which was flooded as sea levels rose between roughly 8,000 and 6,500 years ago. The Thames of the Mesolithic was not the Thames of today. It was a different river, running through a different landscape, joining with rivers from the European continent in the Great Plain of Doggerland. The people who lived along the early Thames were hunters and gatherers, but they were sophisticated hunters and gatherers, capable of complex social organization and long-distance movement, familiar with boats and water travel, living in a world that connected them to populations across what is now the North Sea. When Doggerland flooded, when the North Sea encroached and Britain became an island, something significant happened to the populations of the Thames Valley. They were cut off. The exchange networks that had connected them to the broader northwest European Mesolithic world were severed. They were on an island, and the Thames, which had been part of a broader river system extending into the continent, became the central axis of a much smaller world. That shift, that moment of insularity, may have had profound effects on the cultural development of the population, effects that echo in the archaeology of the subsequent Neolithic period and in the distinctive character of the sacred landscape that developed in the Thames Valley over the following millennia. The people of the London area in the post-Doggerland period would have known what had been lost. The elders would have remembered, or would have heard stories from elders who remembered, the time when the land extended further east and south, when you could walk to the continent without getting your feet wet, when the world was larger. That memory, encoded in mythology, in story, in the carefully transmitted oral tradition that is the primary technology of pre-literate cultures, would have shaped how they thought about the land beneath their feet. The underground, for a people whose world had literally been reduced by the swallowing of Doggerland, might have been charged with particular significance. The earth might have held, in their symbolic understanding, the memory of what was lost. The chambers in the chalk might have been their way of reaching toward what was beneath, toward the drowned world, toward the ancestors who had walked on land that was now sea floor. This is speculative. It is necessarily speculative, because we are talking about the mental world of people who left no written records and whose oral traditions, if any persist, are unrecognized as such. But it is not arbitrary speculation. It is built on the analogy of other cultures whose relationship with sacred underground spaces is well documented and whose engagement with the underground is understood by the people who practice it as a form of connection with ancestral presence and with the world that exists beneath the visible one. The specific circumstances of the London Basin, an island whose people had experienced the literal loss of their world to the sea, would have been fertile ground for exactly this kind of cosmological engagement with what lay beneath the earth. The Blitz. Let us jump forward to the 20th century for a moment, because the Second World War did something to London's underground that would have taken centuries of archaeology to achieve otherwise. It forced hundreds of thousands of people underground. It drove them into cellars, into purpose-built shelters, into the underground stations that became famous symbols of civilian resilience, and into spaces that had never previously been public, spaces that had been sealed and forgotten and built over. And in some of those spaces, workers and shelter users and civil defense personnel encountered things they were not expecting. The accounts are largely anecdotal, because the chaos of wartime London was not a context in which formal archaeological recording was either practical or prioritized. But the anecdotes are consistent enough and come from enough independent sources to be taken seriously. During the construction of deep-level shelters under the central London Underground stations in 1940 and 1941, workers at several locations reported breaking into pre-existing underground spaces, not spaces associated with any known phase of the Underground's construction history. Older spaces, in some cases much older. The accounts from Chancery Lane are probably the most specific. Workers tunnelling for the shelter extension at Chancery Lane Station, which sits above a point where the Fleet Valley meets the chalk ridge of Holborn, reported breaking through into a passage that did not appear on any plan of the underground network or any other known underground infrastructure. The passage ran roughly east to west. It was lined with brick on its upper section, suggesting some post-Roman but pre-modern construction, probably 16th or 17th century. But below the brick lining the passage continued in chalk, unlined, with walls that showed the kind of deliberate smoothing that characterizes the anomalous chalk passages reported from other locations beneath the city. The workers were told to fill the passage and continue tunneling. The supervisor filed a report noting the discovery and recommending further investigation after the war. That follow-up investigation, if it happened at all, produced no public record. The account from Aldwych is less specific but more dramatic. Aldwych Station, which has been closed to regular passengers since 1994 but is still used as a film location, sits at the southern end of the Strand, close to the river. During the conversion of the station to an emergency shelter in 1940, workers in the lower tunnels reported a persistent smell that could not be explained by the station's ventilation, and in one case reported seeing, through a crack in a section of tunnel wall that was being reinforced, a chamber beyond the tunnel wall containing what several witnesses described as standing stones. Not large monumental stones of the Stonehenge variety. Smaller pieces, roughly the size of a person, standing upright in a roughly circular arrangement in a space that appeared to be well beyond the footprint of any known underground structure. The crack was sealed. The reinforcement was completed. The station was put to use as a shelter. No formal investigation was made. Standing stones, beneath the Strand. The Strand runs along the north bank of the Thames through the area that was once the western edge of Roman Londinium and the eastern edge of the Saxon settlement of Londonwick, which developed slightly to the west of the old Roman city in the post-Roman period. It is one of the oldest continuously inhabited strips of ground in the London area. And, if there were stones arranged in a circle beneath it, in a chamber that predates the underground tunnels, and apparently also the foundation level of the surrounding buildings, those stones would represent something extraordinary. Not extraordinary in the sense of impossible. Stone circles are a well-established feature of the prehistoric British landscape. Extraordinary in the sense of hidden. A stone circle sealed underground, beneath one of the most thoroughly documented cities in the world, invisible to centuries of historical investigation. Is the Aldwych account reliable? It is anecdotal. The witnesses were wartime workers, not archaeologists. The conditions were stressful, and the lighting underground in 1940 was poor. There is every reason to apply appropriate skepticism. But there is also no particular reason why these workers would have fabricated an account of underground standing stones, a claim that makes no obvious sense in the context of wartime London, and that would have been met with at best gentle ridicule if they had reported it widely. The consistent element in these accounts, the element that keeps reappearing across different locations and different time periods, is the encounter with something unexpected, something old, something that does not fit within the known parameters of the city's history. And the consistent response, the response of supervisors and officials and the institutions responsible for London's underground infrastructure, is to seal the discovery and move on. The sealed city perpetuates itself. Every time a new layer discovers the old one and closes over it, the old one goes deeper. The chalk passages sink further below the level of daily life. The chambers accumulate more meters of city above them. The carved stones and the worked flint and the mysterious vessels stay in the dark, sealed inside their accretion of centuries, waiting for someone who will take the time to look. There is a man who spent 40 years looking. His name is not well known outside the specialist community of London Underground historians, which is a small community and one that exists in a peculiar relationship with official archaeological and heritage bodies. His name was Graham Laycock, and he spent 4 decades from the 1950s to the 1990s systematically visiting every accessible pre-modern underground space in London that he could find, documenting what he saw in meticulous hand-drawn plans and written descriptions, and trying, without great success, to interest the relevant authorities in what he was finding. Laycock died in 2001, and his archive, comprising dozens of notebooks and hundreds of drawings, passed to a small private collection where it has sat largely unexamined since. Researchers who have had access to portions of it report that it contains detailed plans of underground features in multiple locations across central London that do not correspond to anything in the known survey data. Chambers that Laycock accessed through gaps in post-Blitz construction. Passages that could be entered through maintenance access points in the underground network. Spaces beneath cellars that could be reached through the fabric of Victorian buildings whose basements were accessible to someone with the right combination of persistence and tolerance for confined spaces. What Laycock found, according to those who have seen portions of his archive, is broadly consistent with what the fragmentary official record suggests. An extensive network of underground spaces, concentrated in the oldest parts of the city, varying in age and character, but showing in several locations, features that are clearly prehistoric rather than Roman or medieval. His drawings of the chalk passages beneath the area of Cornhill and Leadenhall, 2 of the highest points in the original Roman city, and therefore presumably among the first areas to have been settled in any period, show features that he described as cup-marked surfaces, referring to the distinctive cup and ring marks of prehistoric stonecraft, and as structured arrangements of place stone that corresponded to no known function in any medieval or Roman context. Whether Laycock's drawings are accurate, whether his identifications of prehistoric features are reliable, whether what he saw matches what he thought he was seeing, these are questions that cannot be answered without access to the sites themselves. And that is precisely the problem. The sites are not accessible. They have been resealed by the construction work that exposed them and then moved on. They sit beneath the infrastructure of a working city whose demands are urgent and immediate and not easily compatible with the slow, careful, time-consuming business of investigating pre-Roman archaeology at depth. The scale of London is part of the challenge. This is the largest city in the Western world by area, a metropolis that covers over 600 square miles of landscape that includes some of the most archaeologically rich ground in Europe. Every year, construction work across this area produces thousands of archaeological finds, most of which are processed and recorded and stored with reasonable efficiency by the specialist units attached to organisations like Museum of London Archaeology. But the resource is finite, and the ground is seemingly inexhaustible in its capacity to produce material. Decisions have to be made about what to investigate and what to note and move on from. Those decisions are made in the context of a framework that assumes, broadly, that the significant periods of London's history are the Roman, Saxon, medieval, and post-medieval periods, and that the pre-Roman material, when it appears, can be adequately understood through reference to the national picture for those periods in Britain. That framework is increasingly difficult to sustain. The national picture for prehistoric Britain is itself changing rapidly, as new excavations and new scientific techniques reveal a complexity and sophistication in pre-Roman British society that the older models cannot accommodate. The discovery of the world's oldest known monument complex at Stonehenge's precursor sites in the 1990s and 2000s, the revelation that Orkney was, in the Neolithic period, one of the most culturally advanced regions in northwest Europe, the identification through ancient DNA analysis of the multiple distinct populations that contributed to the genetic and cultural heritage of prehistoric Britain. All of these developments have opened up the question of what was happening in the landscape before the conventional historical record begins, and the answer, increasingly, is a great deal more than we thought. Applied to London, this revised national picture suggests that the Thames Valley was not a cultural backwater waiting for the Romans to civilize it. It was a significant, long-established, continuously occupied landscape with its own traditions, its own sacred geography, its own engineering capabilities, and its own history stretching back not centuries but millennia before the Roman invasion. The sealed city beneath London is not the remains of a minor pre-Roman settlement. It is the physical legacy of a civilization that the conventional account of British history has not yet found adequate language to describe. Before we go further into the underground record, we need to talk about the river itself, because the Thames is not just the geographical context for this story. The Thames is one of the protagonists. The river and its relationship to the people who have lived along it, in ways that go far beyond the practical use of water and transport, is central to understanding why the sealed city exists and what it contains. The Thames has been, for at least 5,000 years, and probably much longer, a sacred river. Not sacred in a vague, metaphorical sense. Sacred in the specific, practical sense that objects of enormous value were thrown into it, deliberately, as offerings, and that this practice was maintained with such consistency across so many centuries that it becomes impossible to explain as anything other than a deeply held, widely shared religious practice. The number and quality of the objects recovered from the Thames is staggering. The British Museum holds thousands of prehistoric artifacts retrieved from the river, and what is in the museum is a fraction of what exists in private collections, and what has been lost or undocumented over the centuries since the Thames became a major focus of treasure hunting, and later of systematic collecting. Bronze Age swords of extraordinary workmanship. Iron Age shields that represent some of the finest metalwork ever produced in Britain, helmets, torques, the great twisted gold neck rings associated with elite status in Celtic society, cauldrons, personal ornaments of types that have no parallel anywhere else, objects whose condition suggests they were not worn and discarded but new, unworn, placed in the river at the moment of their peak value. The Battersea shield is perhaps the most famous of these finds. Discovered in the Thames in the 19th century, it dates to around 350 to 50 BC and is made of bronze with red glass enamel inlays in a design of extraordinary geometric complexity. It is too thin to have functioned as a practical shield. It was made to be offered to the river. Someone of considerable wealth and status commissioned this object from craftspeople of exceptional skill and then put it in the water. That is an act of faith, of religious commitment, of cosmological engagement with the Thames as a sacred entity that demands and receives the finest that human skill can produce. The Battersea shield is famous because it is spectacular and because it ended up in the British Museum. But around it, in the Thames mud of the same stretch of river, were dozens of other objects that did not make it into museum collections. Objects that were sold to private collectors, or melted down, or simply lost in the chaos of Victorian riverwork. The Battersea area of the Thames has produced more prehistoric metalwork per square metre than virtually any other stretch of river in Britain. And it is not the only hotspot. The City of London stretch, the Hammersmith Reach, the Long Bend at Twickenham, all of these areas show concentrations of prehistoric depositional activity that correspond to the sacred landscape of the Thames Valley rather than to any practical consideration of where objects might conveniently be discarded. The sacred landscape of the Thames was not random, it was organized. The depositional hotspots correspond to specific geographical features, to bends in the river, to confluences with tributary streams, to points where the river narrows, to the crossing points where the distance between the banks was shortest and where, therefore, the interaction between the north and south banks was most intense. These are not the places where objects would accidentally end up if they fell overboard or were carried downstream. They are places that were chosen, returned to repeatedly over centuries and millennia, and used for the specific purpose of placing valuables in the water. Someone was in charge of this, not necessarily a centralized authority. but some form of organized religious practice that identified the appropriate locations and maintained the tradition of deposition across a period of time so long that it encompasses multiple cultural phases, multiple technological shifts, multiple apparent changes in the ethnic composition of the population. That continuity is perhaps the most important thing to understand about the Thames sacred landscape. It did not begin with the Bronze Age. The Bronze Age is when the metal objects start, but the practice of depositing valuables in the river is much older. Worked flint and carved bone from Mesolithic and early Neolithic contexts has been recovered from the same stretches of river that later produced the spectacular Bronze Age metalwork. The people who threw their finest bronze swords into the Thames at Battersea were continuing a tradition of river offering that had been established centuries or millennia before bronze was known in Britain. They inherited the sacred geography of the river from their predecessors, maintained it, elaborated it with the new materials available to them, and passed it on to their own successors, who continued the practice through the Iron Age, and in some cases, in modified form, into the Roman and post-Roman periods. This is the pattern of London: inheritance, continuation, elaboration. Each new population finding the sacred places already marked, already used, and choosing to engage with them rather than abandon them. The Romans did not worship the Thames in the same way as the pre-Roman Celts or the Bronze Age populations before them, but they found the river's sacredness so well established, so embedded in the landscape, that they incorporated it into their own sacred geography rather than dismissing it. They built temples at the points where the pre-Roman tradition had concentrated its activities. They offered their own objects to the river. They acknowledged, in the way that practically minded people acknowledge things they do not fully understand but cannot ignore, that this river mattered. Below the river is another world, and it is a world that the sealed city beneath London reaches toward, in a way that the archaeology increasingly suggests was deliberate. The Thames is tidal in its London reach, and the tidal dynamics of the river have always created certain locations where the boundary between the river and the land is ambiguous, where the ground disappears underwater twice a day, and reappears with each low tide. The foreshore, that strip of river mud and gravel that is exposed for a few hours each day and submerged for the rest of the time, is one of the most archaeologically productive surfaces in Britain. Finds accumulate there and then get reburied by the next tide, only to be re-exposed by subsequent erosion, in a slow geological shuffle that brings objects from multiple periods into contact with each other in a continuous sequence. The foreshore archaeologists, the people who systematically survey these strips of exposed river mud with permits from the Port of London Authority, have in recent years been finding an increasing number of objects that are difficult to categorize. Objects that do not match the known typologies for any of the conventional periods of London's history. Objects whose form and material suggest considerable antiquity but whose specific parallels are unclear. Some of these objects appear to be related to the chalk-carved pieces from the Southwark and Billingsgate contexts. Fragments of worked chalk, pieces of carved bone with geometric designs, and in one instance, reported by a licensed foreshore researcher in 2019, a section of worked timber with decorative carving of a type that the researcher, a specialist in prehistoric wood, described as consistent with a late Neolithic or early Bronze Age date, but structurally unlike any known example from that period. The timber was reported to the relevant authorities. It was photographed and logged, and then the tide came in, and when the researcher returned at the next low tide, the piece was no longer in the same location, having been moved by the current to somewhere further along the foreshore or back into the riverbed where it had spent the previous 3,000 to 4,000 years. That is how it goes with the Thames. The river gives and takes back. It shows you things briefly and then reclaims them. It maintains its secrets in the mud, releasing fragments to the surface on its own schedule, according to its own logic, which is the logic of tides and erosion and the slow rearrangement of sediment over centuries. The sealed city below the city and the sacred river beside the city are not two separate stories. They are the same story, approached from different angles. Both speak to the same pre-Roman, pre-Celtic, deeply ancient relationship between the people of the Thames Valley and this specific landscape. A relationship so durable, so deeply embedded in the cultural and perhaps even genetic inheritance of the people who have lived here, that it has persisted through every conquest and every cultural transformation the city has experienced. Let us talk about the London Stone. The London Stone is a small piece of limestone that currently sits in a glass case set into the wall of 111 Cannon Street, which happens to be very close to the Cannon Street station chamber we described earlier. It has been in this general area since at least the 12th century AD, when it appears in historical records as a significant marker in the City of London. It was used as a reference point for proclamations, for the declaration of legal instruments, for the measurement of distances. In 1450, when Jack Cade led his Kentish rebels into London during the political crisis of Henry VI's reign, one of his first acts on entering the city was to go to the London Stone and strike it with his sword. This was not theatre. This was a claim of sovereignty, an assertion of authority enacted through engagement with the stone, as if the stone itself was a guarantor of the city's legitimacy, as if whoever controlled the stone controlled London. Where did this significance come from? The stone's origins are obscure even by the standards of London antiquity. It appears in medieval records as an ancient object, already ancient in the 12th century. William Camden, the Elizabethan antiquarian who wrote the comprehensive survey of Britain known as Britannia, speculated that it was a Roman milestone, the central point from which all distances in Roman Britain were measured. Some modern scholars have accepted this interpretation, but the stone does not match the known typology of Roman milestones. Its shape and material are wrong for a Roman measuring post, and more importantly, the kind of reverence accorded to it in the medieval period, the use of it as a sovereignty marker, as a place for solemn oaths and civic proclamations, suggests a significance that goes beyond its utility as a distance marker. John Stowe, the 16th century chronicler of London, provides the most detailed early account of the stone, and his account is notable for what it does not say. He does not know what the stone is. He knows that it is very old. He knows that it is treated with great respect. He records the various ways in which it has been used over the centuries, but he has no explanation for its origin or its original purpose, and he is honest enough to say so. Stowe is the most reliable and careful of the early London historians, and his admission of ignorance about the stone's origins is significant. If the stone's origin were within the recorded historical period, Stowe would have known it. His ignorance implies that the stone predates his sources, which means it predates the Norman conquest, which likely means it predates the Saxon period, which puts its origin in the Roman period at earliest, and possibly before. The most interesting theory about the London Stone, and the one that the material evidence fits best, is that it is the remnant of a prehistoric standing stone. Not a wayside marker, not a milestone, but a stone erected in the prehistoric period as part of the sacred landscape of the Thames Valley, marking a specific point, possibly the original focal point of the entire complex of sacred geography that we have been examining. If the London Stone marks the centre of the pre-Roman sacred landscape, then everything else, the chalk passages, the vaulted chambers, the depositional hotspots in the river, the alignments of later Roman temples, would be organized around it, oriented toward it, connected to it by a web of sacred geography that the city has been building over and around for 2,500 years. This interpretation cannot be proved. The stone has been moved several times in the historical period, as the buildings around it were rebuilt, so its current location may not be its original position. But the persistence of its significance, the fact that it retained its importance through the Saxon and Norman and medieval periods, used for sovereignty claims and legal proclamations by people who did not know where it came from or what it originally meant, suggests that something in the physical or cultural memory of the city kept directing attention back to this object. That is not the behavior of a Roman milestone. It is the behavior of something much older, whose significance was embedded so deeply in the landscape that it survived the destruction of the culture that created it. The night of the Great Fire, the second night, when the wind shifted and the fire that had been burning east to west suddenly turned and began consuming the wharves and warehouses along the river. John Evelyn, the diarist, stood on the south bank and watched London burn, and he wrote one of the most vivid accounts of the destruction. He described the collapse of the city's churches, the melting of the bells, the roar of the fire consuming buildings that had stood for centuries. And he described, in a passage that is sometimes quoted in isolation without its full context, the opening of the ground. He writes that in several places the fire burned so intensely at ground level that it penetrated through the foundations of buildings, and that in those places men could see, briefly, before the heat became unbearable, glimpses of older structures below. He describes this as a revelation of the city's age, a moment when the destruction of the visible city revealed the invisible city beneath. He does not describe what those older structures looked like in detail. The heat was too intense for prolonged observation. But he notes that they appeared to be of considerable extent, and that in one location, which he places near the area of the old fish market at Billingsgate, the structures appeared to be made of a stone different from any in use in the contemporary city. The different stone. What kind of stone would appear beneath a 17th century city's foundations that would be notable for being different? Not Roman brick, which was familiar and common in London. Not medieval ragstone, which was the standard building material of the medieval city. Something else. Something that Evelyn, a well-educated and observant man with a sophisticated understanding of architecture and materials, recognized as unusual. Chalk, limestone worked in an unfamiliar manner, a stone type not commonly found in London's construction record. The fire eventually burned itself out. The city was rebuilt. The glimpses of the underground closed over. Wren began designing his great rebuilding program, the 52 new churches and the new St. Paul's that would transform the skyline of London. And beneath the rubble of the old city, beneath the new foundations being laid in the years after 1666, the underground went back into darkness. But Evelyn had seen something, and Evelyn was not a man who saw things that were not there. The Underground Railway changed everything and nothing. When the Metropolitan Railway opened in 1863, the world's first urban underground railway, and the subsequent expansion of the network over the following decades, drove tunnels through the ground beneath London at a scale and depth that no previous engineering project had achieved. It produced thousands of archaeological finds. It also produced, buried in the engineering records and the construction diaries and the informal accounts of the navvies who did the digging, dozens of references to unexpected underground features, chambers, passages, structures that were not in any plan and that did not correspond to anything that should have been there. The official position of London Underground and its predecessors on these discoveries has been consistent throughout the history of the network. Anomalous underground features encountered during construction are to be noted, photographed where possible, and sealed. The tunnels continue on their planned routes. Diversions are made around significant structural voids to preserve the integrity of the railway. Investigations are deferred to a time when resources permit. That time has not, in 160 years of the underground's existence, reliably arrived. There is a section of tunnel in the central line, in the stretch between Bank and St. Paul's stations, where the tunnel was diverted from its originally planned alignment in 1899. The diversion is subtle enough that most passengers would never notice it, a slight curve that adds a modest distance to the tunnel's route. The engineering records from 1899 give the reason for the diversion as unforeseen geological conditions, which is the phrase used to describe any underground feature that was not predicted by the survey and that cannot easily be demolished or incorporated into the tunnel design. In this case, the unforeseen geological condition was described in the internal records, which a researcher obtained under the predecessor legislation to what is now the Freedom of Information Act in the 1980s, as a large void of artificial origin, not consistent with any known phase of subsurface engineering in the area. The void was sealed. The tunnel was routed around it. The central line runs its curve through the bedrock between Bank and St. Paul's, and whatever the void contains is undisturbed and inaccessible, locked inside the curve of a railway tunnel like a secret kept inside a bent elbow. These are not isolated incidents. They are part of a pattern that extends across the entire life of the underground network and before it back through every phase of major construction in the city. The pattern is this. The ground beneath London contains things that were not put there by any phase of the city's known history. Those things, when encountered, are sealed and worked around rather than investigated, and the accumulation of these sealed encounters, spread across a century and a half of underground construction and 2,000 years of urban development before that, represents an enormous and growing archive of evidence about the deep prehistory of the London site that nobody has yet systematically synthesized. The synthesis is possible. The data exists, scattered across engineering records, archaeological archives, personal accounts, published footnotes, unpublished theses, and private collections. It is not a secret in the sense of being actively suppressed. It is more a secret in the sense of being disaggregated, dispersed into so many separate contexts that no single institution has ever had either the incentive or the resources to pull it all together. The Museum of London holds thousands of finds from pre-Roman contexts whose significance has not been fully assessed. The London Metropolitan Archives contains construction records going back to the 19th century that have been systematically catalogued but not systematically interpreted. Transport for London's engineering archives contain references to underground anomalies from every decade of the network's history. Private collections hold material from Victorian and Edwardian building works that was removed from sites before any formal recording system existed. If you wanted to understand the sealed city beneath London, you would need to bring all of this material together. You would need to map it spatially to see the geographic patterns in the distribution of the anomalous features. You would need to date it to establish the chronological sequence of the underground activity that the evidence represents. You would need to compare it with the known prehistoric landscapes of the wider Thames Valley to situate the London material within the regional context that gives it meaning. And you would need to do all of this with an intellectual framework that is open to the possibility that what you are looking at does not correspond neatly to any existing category in British prehistoric archaeology, because what the London evidence suggests, when you look at it whole rather than in fragments, is something that we do not yet have good language for. A pre-urban, urban tradition. An organized, sustained, geographically coherent engagement with the London landscape that stretches back thousands of years before the Romans, that produced physical structures of considerable complexity and apparent symbolic significance, and that was maintained with enough continuity across the upheavals of prehistoric British history to leave a recognizable pattern across the entire archaeological record of the site. Not a city in any sense that modern usage recognizes, but not the scattered, seasonally occupied landscape of the conventional prehistory of southern Britain either. Something in between. Something that was more organized and more durable than a temporary settlement, but did not have the monumental above-ground architecture that we associate with urban civilization. Something that expressed itself primarily underground, in the chalk, in the river, in the chambers and passages that have been accumulating beneath what is now London for millennia. The sealed city. Not built and then buried. Built underground from the beginning. A civilization that chose, for whatever reasons, to invest its most significant structures not in the visible landscape but in the hidden one. That placed its most important objects not on hillsides or in open-air sanctuaries, but in chambers cut into the chalk, in the mud of the sacred river, in spaces that could be closed and sealed and preserved against the endless disturbances of the surface world. A civilization whose public face was the ordinary landscape of a prehistoric community, farmsteads and trackways and open-air meeting places, but whose deepest expression of meaning and value was directed downward, into the earth, into the dark, into the space beneath the world. There is a specific quality to the darkness of the London Underground that regular commuters know but rarely articulate. It is not just the absence of light. It is the weight of the dark, the sense of the earth pressing in on both sides of the tunnel, the awareness that the ground through which you are passing is not empty. Experienced tube drivers talk about it. Maintenance workers who spend their shifts in the tunnels after the last train has run talk about it. The underground has its own folklore, its own collection of stories about what is encountered in the tunnels at night, about the sounds that come from sections of tunnel that are closed off, about the doors in the tunnel walls that appear on no plan, about the spaces that the official maps do not acknowledge. Some of this is the ordinary mythology of any place where people work alone in the dark. Some of it is something else. The ghost stations are part of this folklore, and they are also part of the documentary record. London Underground has more than 40 stations that have been closed at various points in the network's history, some abandoned after only a few years of operation, others serving for decades before closure. Several of these stations are simply sealed, their entrances blocked, their platforms and tunnels intact behind brick walls and locked doors. They appear occasionally in television and film productions that rent them as locations. They are maintained minimally by underground engineering teams. And they sit in the tunnel network, dark and quiet, accessible only to those with the right keys and the right authorization, containing within their sealed spaces the accumulated residue of their years of use and the whatever it is that the tunnels around them contain. Aldwych, already mentioned in the context of the wartime accounts, is the most famous of these. It was built in 1907 as the southern terminus of a short branch line from Holborn, and it served intermittently for decades, with periods of closure and reopening, before finally shutting in 1994. During its wartime conversion as a shelter, several 100,000 people used it. During its later years as a film location, production crews reported consistent accounts of what could only be described as discomfort, a persistent feeling of unease that could not be attributed to any physical cause, that seemed to be specific to certain areas of the station, particularly the deeper sections of the tunnel beyond the platform ends. Production staff who had worked in dozens of other closed stations described Aldwych as qualitatively different, not frightening in a superficial way. Deeply, fundamentally uncomfortable, in a way that made people want to leave. Whether this is meaningful or not, whether it reflects something real about the space or simply the accumulated weight of wartime memory in a place that was used during one of the most traumatic periods in London's history, is a question that cannot be answered with the available evidence. But it connects to something else, to the accounts of what was found in the tunnels beneath and around Aldwych during construction and during the wartime conversion, and to the presence, noted in the 1899 engineering records for the Piccadilly line extension that incorporated the Aldwych branch, of a large pre-existing underground void in the area of the Strand, which was noted, sealed, and routed around. That void is beneath Aldwych station. It is what the wartime workers reported, glimpsing through the crack in the tunnel wall, and it is still there. The archaeology of the Strand area above ground gives some context for what that void might be. The Strand runs along a slightly elevated ridge parallel to the Thames, slightly north of the medieval riverside buildings and the Roman riverside quays. In the Roman period, the area between the Strand and the river was intensively used for commercial and potentially ritual purposes. In the Saxon period, the new settlement of Londonwick that replaced the abandoned Roman city developed along the Strand, and its dense occupation left a significant archaeological footprint that has been partially recovered through excavations during 20th century construction. Below the Saxon and Roman levels, in the gravel and clay of the natural subsoil, the same pre-Roman features that characterize the rest of central London's deep archaeology appear here too, and in the area immediately beneath and around what is now Aldwych, those pre-Roman features include some of the clearest evidence yet for the kind of organized underground activity that the whole London story points toward. A small excavation conducted in 1999 during preparatory work for the Jubilee Line extension, which passes close to but not directly through the Aldwych area, recovered from a depth of approximately 8 meters, a collection of material that the archaeologists who found it described in their report as consistent with a ritual deposit of late Bronze Age or early Iron Age date. Worked flint, fragments of ceramic vessels of pre-Roman type, pieces of worked bone, and 3 pieces of carved chalk, each roughly the size of a hand, bearing geometric designs that matched in type and execution the chalk pieces from the Southwark collection. 3 more pieces in the same tradition, the same practice, the same creative engagement with the chalk and with the underground, from a location a mile to the west of Southwark Cathedral. The same tradition, spread across the landscape, confirming that what we are looking at is not a local eccentricity, but a geographically extensive and culturally coherent practice. The 1999 report is available in the Archaeological Grey Literature Archive, maintained by what is now Historic England. It is not publicised. It does not appear in any popular history of London or the Underground. It is a technical document, written for specialists, filed in an archive, accessible in principle to anyone with the patience and knowledge to find it. This is how the sealed city perpetuates its own invisibility. Not through active suppression, but through the structural mechanics of how archaeological information is produced and stored. It gets recorded, it gets filed, it sits in the archive, and it waits for someone who knows it is there to go and look at it. Something happened along the Thames during the transition between the Neolithic and the Bronze Age, roughly between 2500 and 1800 BC, that is not fully understood even in the national archaeological picture, and that has particular resonance for the London story. This was the period when the great megalithic monument-building traditions of the British Neolithic, the long barrows, the causewayed enclosures, the first phase of Stonehenge, were being transformed or replaced by the new cultural configurations associated with the Beaker people, the population that appears in the genetic and archaeological record during this period, and that brought with them not just new pottery styles but new religious practices, new burial customs, and apparently new ideas about the relationship between the sacred landscape and the human community that inhabited it. The Beaker people, as they are conventionally called, did not immediately or completely replace the Neolithic population of Britain. The genetic evidence, which has been revolutionized over the past decade by improvements in ancient DNA analysis, shows a complex picture of partial population replacement and admixture, with regional variation in how thoroughly the new population displaced the old. In southern Britain, including the Thames Valley, the transition appears to have been relatively rapid and complete, with the Beaker-associated genetic profile becoming dominant within a few generations. But what happened to the Neolithic population? Some were absorbed, some moved, and some, according to the emerging pattern of the archaeological evidence, went underground. Not literally underground in the first instance, though that is where their legacy ends up, but culturally underground. The great Neolithic monuments of southern Britain, the long barrows, the causewayed enclosures, were not simply abandoned during the Beaker transition. They were modified, their entrances were blocked, their chambers were sealed. The material culture of the Neolithic, the distinctive pottery, the polished stone axes, the carved chalk objects, was placed within these sealed spaces, as if being deliberately archived, deliberately preserved against the possibility of a future in which it might again be needed. The sealing of the great Neolithic monuments of Britain during the Bronze Age transition is a well-documented phenomenon. What has not been clearly articulated is the possibility that the same process was happening not just at the above-ground monuments, but at the below-ground sacred spaces as well. The underground chambers beneath what is now London, if they were in active use during the Neolithic period, would have been candidates for exactly the same kind of deliberate sealing and preservation that was applied to the surface monuments. They would have been closed, their contents preserved, their locations marked but not publicly visible, their significance maintained in oral tradition or in the encoded forms of myth and story through which pre-literate cultures preserve critical knowledge. The Welsh and Irish mythological traditions, which are the closest available analogues for the oral traditions of the pre-Roman British population, are full of references to underground spaces of special significance. Otherworldly realms entered through caves or through pools or through the sides of hills. Places where time moved differently, where the dead still spoke, where the powers that governed the natural world could be approached and negotiated with. The specific geography of these otherworldly entries in Welsh mythology, the places named in the Mabinogion and in later medieval texts as points of access to the other world, includes several locations that correspond to features of the London area. The Hill of Lud, which appears in the Welsh tradition as a significant otherworldly entry point, is generally identified by scholars who work on this material as Ludgate Hill, the same hill on which St. Paul's Cathedral stands, the same hill that John Aubrey described as containing remains of a pre-Roman sacred site of unknown character. Lud in the Welsh tradition is not simply a hill. It is a figure, a king, whose underground chambers are described in medieval Welsh texts as containing the treasures and the secrets of the island of Britain. Geoffrey of Monmouth incorporates Lud into his legendary history of Britain as the king who rebuilt and renamed the city that became London, calling it Caer Lud, or Caerlud, the city of Lud. Geoffrey is a notoriously unreliable historian by modern standards, but his legendary history preserves, in the way that all legend preserves things, elements of older tradition, the identification of a figure named Lud with the founding of the city at the Thames, and the association of that figure with underground chambers containing the island's most important secrets, is not something Geoffrey would have invented from nothing. He was working with existing material, and the existing material, whatever its original form, seems to have identified the London site as a place of underground significance, a place where something important was kept beneath the surface, in the dark, sealed away from ordinary access. The treasure of Lud, the secrets of the island of Britain, These are mythological formulations of something that the archaeology is beginning to confirm. Beneath London, in the chalk and the gravel and the river mud, there is an archive. Not a treasure in the sense of gold or jewels. A treasure in the sense of accumulated meaning, accumulated history, accumulated evidence of the relationship between the people of this place and the place itself, built up over thousands of years and deposited underground with the same care and intention that the Bronze Age metalworkers brought to their offerings in the Thames. The sealed city is the archive of London's deep past. And the reason it has never been properly opened and read is not that nobody has tried, but that the city above it has been continuously occupied, continuously built upon, continuously generating the urgent demands of present-day life that make the slow, careful business of reaching the past seem like a luxury that can always be deferred. The story changes slightly when you move south of the river. Southwark, the South Bank settlement, developed slightly differently from the North Bank city, and its archaeological profile reflects that difference. Where the North Bank Londinium was the planned Roman commercial centre, Southwark was more organically developed, growing up around the southern approach to the bridge, accumulating successive layers of occupation, without the grid plan discipline that the Romans imposed on the North Bank. And in Southwark, the pre-Roman archaeology is in some ways more clearly visible, because the later development was less comprehensively planned and therefore less thoroughly destructive of the earlier material. The Southwark archaeological sequence is one of the richest in London, and some of the most significant work has been done not in the high-profile excavations at Borough Market or around London Bridge, but in the smaller, less visible investigations that have happened during the constant low-level construction and maintenance work that characterises a densely built urban area. The investigations beneath Southwark Cathedral have produced the carved chalk objects already described, but they have also produced, in the decades since those first 19th century excavations, additional material that has quietly deepened the picture. A sequence of timber structures, preserved in the waterlogged ground beneath the cathedral precinct, that appears to represent at minimum 3 separate phases of construction, the earliest dating to the Middle Bronze Age, and all of them organized around what appears to be a deliberate alignment toward the north, toward the river, toward the crossing point where London Bridge now stands. An alignment, structures built in alignment, in sequences, over centuries, all oriented toward the same point. This is not casual occupation. This is the deliberate, sustained engagement of a community with a specific sacred geography, maintained across multiple generations and multiple cultural transitions, because the place itself demanded that engagement. The crossing of the river was sacred. The hill above the crossing was sacred. The underground spaces beneath the hill were sacred. And the tradition of building at that place, in orientation with those sacred points, was maintained from the Bronze Age into the Roman period, and from the Roman period into the Christian era, when the cathedral was built, and the tradition of sacredness at the site was given a new theological form without the underlying geography changing at all. The Tabard Inn, Southwark. Chaucer's pilgrims set out from a Southwark inn to walk to Canterbury, to the shrine of Thomas Becket at Canterbury Cathedral. Canterbury was the most important pilgrimage site in medieval England, and the pilgrim route from London to Canterbury followed, for its first stretch, a road that was itself very old. The Roman road from Londinium to Dubris, the road to Dover, ran through Southwark and out through the southeast of the city. But the road to Canterbury was already old when the Romans built it. It followed a ridge route, a ridgeway that was a feature of the prehistoric landscape of southeast Britain long before Roman surveyors laid their straight lines across it. The pilgrims who walked from Southwark to Canterbury in the medieval period were following a route that had been used for 1,000 years before Christ. They were walking on the bones of a much older tradition, a tradition that led from the sacred crossing of the Thames to the sacred complex at Canterbury, whose pre-Christian significance we are only beginning to understand. Canterbury itself has underground chambers. They have been known about for centuries. The medieval cathedral was built on a site with pre-Roman occupation, going back to the Iron Age. Roman Canterbury, Dura Vernum Cantiacorum, was a major regional centre, and it was built, in the usual Roman manner, on top of the pre-existing settlement. Beneath the Roman city and the Saxon city and the Norman cathedral and the medieval city, Archaeologists have found evidence of Iron Age and Bronze Age activity that suggests Canterbury was a significant sacred site long before it became a Roman city or a Christian pilgrimage destination. The road from London to Canterbury was not just a road, it was a pilgrimage route in the original pre-Christian sense. A path between two sacred centres, marked and maintained for thousands of years, walked by people whose reasons for making the journey were encoded in mythologies we no longer have access to, but whose sacred geography we can still trace in the landscape. This is the larger picture within which the sealed city beneath London sits. London is not an isolated phenomenon. It is a node in a network of sacred sites that covers the landscape of southeast Britain, connected by ancient trackways and river routes and sightlines between significant points. The Thames is one axis of this network. The prehistoric ridgeways of the North Downs and the Chilterns are others. The network of ancient sites along the chalk spine of southern England, running from the Wash to Salisbury Plain, is the structural backbone of the whole. And London, at the tidal head of the Thames, at the crossing point between north and south, between the chalk uplands and the river marshes, is one of the most significant nodes in that network. Its underground chambers are the London end of something that extends across a much larger landscape. There are researchers who take this broader network seriously, who have spent careers mapping the ancient sacred geography of southern Britain and who have, over the course of their work, arrived at the London site and found the same things we have been examining. The underground features that cluster around the oldest parts of the city, the correspondences between the locations of Roman temples and pre-Roman sacred sites, the evidence in the medieval historical record for an underground significance that cannot be explained by practical function alone, and they have found something else. When you map the significant points in the ancient sacred geography of southeast Britain, the stone circles, the long barrows, the causewayed enclosures, the hill forts, the river crossing points, and you look for the geometric relationships between them, the alignments and sightlines and proportional relationships that prehistoric monument builders demonstrably used in their placement of structures across the landscape, London sits at the intersection of multiple such alignments. It is not a coincidence of geography. It is a placement. The London site, this specific bend of the Thames, this specific combination of hills and valleys and river crossings, was chosen, not by the Romans, not by the Celts, by whoever created the sacred geography of prehistoric Britain, which means by people who were working with a level of spatial planning and landscape management that the conventional prehistory of Britain has not yet fully credited them with. The landscape archaeology of prehistoric Britain is a field that has expanded dramatically over the past 3 decades, driven partly by the availability of aerial photography and more recently of LiDAR survey data that can reveal subtle features of the ancient landscape invisible at ground level. LiDAR, light detection and ranging, fires laser pulses at the ground from aircraft and uses the reflected signal to build a precise 3-dimensional model of the terrain, including features that are hidden beneath vegetation or that have been obscured by centuries of cultivation and development, but that still leave faint traces in the microtopography of the land surface. LiDAR survey of the London area has been ongoing since the early 2000s, and the results have produced some striking revelations about the ancient landscape of the Thames Valley. In the area of the Thames floodplain west of the city, LiDAR has revealed a series of crop marks, the faint discolorations in agricultural land that indicate the presence of buried structures that correspond to ring ditches, the enclosures associated with prehistoric barrows and other ceremonial monuments. Some of these crop marks have been known from aerial photography since the 1960s. But the LiDAR survey has revealed additional features that were previously unknown, including what appear to be large rectangular enclosures and linear earthworks that would be consistent with a late Neolithic or Bronze Age ceremonial landscape of considerable extent. This landscape extends, in the LiDAR data, toward the eastern margins of what is now the urban sprawl of Greater London, and in the area that would have been the western approach to the ancient crossing point of the Thames. The pattern of features in the LiDAR data suggests something that has not yet been formally published, but that the researchers who have examined the data have described in conference presentations as potentially a very significant prehistoric complex, comparable in scale, if not in architectural form, to the ceremonial landscapes of Salisbury Plain or the Orkneys. A complex that was, in historical times, not buried by nature, but buried by the city that grew up over it, layer by layer, building by building, century by century, until what had once been a visible and significant landscape feature became an invisible substrate for everything that came after. The buried landscape west of the City of London, the chalk chambers beneath Cannon Street and Cornhill, the sealed, vaulted spaces under Southwark Cathedral, the pre-existing void beneath Aldwych Station, the standing stones reported behind the tunnel wall in 1940, the chalk objects bearing prehistoric geometric designs recovered from multiple locations across the city's archaeological sequence, the London Stone on Cannon Street, preserving in its stubborn survival the memory of a much older marker, the cluster of skull deposits in the sacred valley of the Walbrook, the deliberate alignments of Roman temples with pre-Roman sacred sites, the medieval chronicles that describe a city beneath the city, a Troia Nuid, a Caer of Lud, a place of underground significance and sovereign meaning that predates any civilization the standard history of London acknowledges. All of these things are real. They exist in the physical record, in the documentary record, in the engineering records, in the archaeological reports. They are not fabrications. They are not the inventions of conspiracy theorists or the hallucinations of people who want London to be more mysterious than it is. They are evidence. Scattered, fragmented, buried under the requirements of urban life and the institutional inertia of heritage management in one of the world's most demanding cities. But evidence, nonetheless. Evidence that points, when assembled and examined whole, toward a conclusion that the standard account of London's origins does not accommodate. London is old. Much older than the Romans, much older than the Celts. The sacred landscape of the Thames Valley, the network of underground chambers and river offerings and sacred hill sites that constitutes the pre-Roman heritage of the London area, was the creation of people who were here for thousands of years before any of the populations that the historical record acknowledges. Their presence is written in the chalk beneath the city. It is preserved in the sealed chambers that construction crews have been discovering and resealing for a century and a half. It is encoded in the mythology of the Welsh chronicles, in the London Stone's stubborn significance, in the placement of Roman temples on pre-existing sacred sites, in the medieval builders' matter-of-fact references to vaulted chambers containing ancient objects beneath the city's foundations. The sealed city is their legacy, and the reason it is sealed is not entirely a mystery. Some of the sealing was deliberate, done by the people who built the chambers to preserve their contents against disturbance. Some was incidental, the result of later construction burying earlier remains. Some was active, done by Roman or later authorities who wanted to limit access to sites of continued indigenous significance. And some, in the modern period, has been institutional, the result of resource constraints and planning priorities that consistently defer investigation of the deep pre-Roman layers in favor of the better understood historical periods above. But there is another possibility that the evidence raises, and it is the most uncomfortable one, the one that the institutional archaeology of London has the most difficulty addressing directly. What if some of the sealing was done by people who knew what was down there and believed, for reasons that may or may not have been justified, that it should not be opened? Not because it was dangerous in any physical sense, but because what was down there belonged to a tradition of understanding the world, a relationship between human communities and the sacred landscape they inhabited that could not survive contact with the extractive, disembedded, documentation-centered culture that modern archaeology represents. The chalk objects in the Southwark chambers were placed there as part of a living practice, a relationship between people and place that required the underground to stay underground. Opening the chambers does not simply recover the objects, it disrupts the relationship, and the people who placed those objects there understood that disruption as a form of damage not to themselves, but to the fabric of meaning that the objects and the chambers together constituted. This is not a reason to leave the archaeology uninvestigated. It is a reason to approach it with the kind of seriousness that it deserves, which means treating the underground spaces of London not just as data sources for academic analysis, but as places that carry a weight of accumulated human significance that demands respect alongside curiosity. The sealed city beneath London is not just a collection of artifacts and structures. It is a record of the longest-running human engagement with a specific landscape that the British Isles can document. And what it asks of us, if we approach it honestly, is not just investigation but attention. The kind of attention that notices that the ground beneath the most familiar city in the English-speaking world is not empty, not understood, not finished surprising us. The night workers of London have always known this. The engineers who maintain the underground through the quiet hours before the first train. The Thames flood defence teams who walk the river walls in winter. The archaeologists who take advantage of construction closures to work in the restricted access areas of the city's oldest sites. The foreshore walkers who watch the Thames at low tide and find things in the mud that they do not always know what to do with. These are the people who have the most sustained, direct relationship with the underground London, and they are the people who most consistently describe the quality of that relationship in terms that go beyond the practical. The sense of depth, the awareness of accumulated time. The feeling, which experienced underground workers especially tend to report, that the tunnels contain something more than infrastructure. They are not wrong. The tunnels contain the accumulated depth of a city whose underground history stretches back further than its above-ground history by a margin so enormous that it changes the entire perspective on what London is. London is not a city that has an underground. London is an underground that has a city built on top of it. The streets and the buildings and the transport network and the 2,000 years of documented urban history are the most recent layer of a much, much longer story. And the layers below, in the chalk and the river mud and the sealed chambers and the passages that run between spaces nobody remembers making, are waiting with the patience of the very old, as they have always waited, for someone to come down and look. The question of why the sealed city has stayed sealed for so long is, ultimately, less interesting than the question of what it would mean to open it, not to excavate it destructively, in the way that Victorian construction work excavated so much of London's underground heritage without preserving what was found, but to investigate it carefully, systematically, with the full suite of modern, non-destructive survey techniques available to contemporary archaeology. Ground-penetrating radar, muon tomography, which uses cosmic ray particles to image underground spaces through solid rock, acoustic profiling, three-dimensional photogrammetry of any spaces that can be entered without disturbance. The technology to map the underground of London without physically disturbing it exists. What does not yet exist is the institutional will to deploy that technology in a sustained, systematic program focused specifically on the pre-Roman underground heritage of the city. What would we find if we did? The honest answer is that we do not know. The evidence suggests we would find more chambers, more passages, more sealed spaces containing material that predates any known phase of London's documented history. We might find the evidence to establish the spatial extent and coherent organization of the prehistoric underground complex that the scattered existing evidence implies. We might be able to date the chambers more precisely, to understand the chronological sequence of their construction and use, to trace the development of the tradition they represent across the millennia of pre-Roman London's existence. We might find objects, more chalk carvings, more ceramic vessels, more of the worked bone and organic material that tends to survive in the sealed, stable environment of the underground. We might find something we are not expecting. The history of archaeology is the history of finding things nobody expected to find. And London's underground, unsystematically probed over a century and a half of construction work, has already produced enough unexpected things to justify the prediction that systematic investigation would produce more. But there is a larger stake here than the specific finds of any excavation program. The sealed city beneath London, if properly investigated and interpreted, has the potential to change the narrative of British prehistory in ways that matter beyond academic circles. The standard story of Britain, taught in schools and repeated in popular media, begins with the Romans and treats everything before as a vague, primitive prelude. The reality, which the archaeology consistently demonstrates but which has not yet broken through into the popular consciousness, is that the British Isles were home to sophisticated, organized, culturally complex societies for thousands of years before Rome arrived. Societies that built monuments we are still trying to understand. Societies that maintained sacred landscapes of extraordinary coherence and sophistication across millennia of cultural change. Societies that, in the case of the prehistoric communities of the Thames Valley, created an underground complex beneath what is now the largest city in the Western world, and that maintained and elaborated that complex across the better part of 3,000 years. That is a story worth telling. It is a story that belongs to everyone, not just to the academic specialists who currently hold the key to most of the evidence. It is the story of the real founding of London. Not by Brutus the Trojan, not by the Romans, not by the Saxon invaders, or the Norman conquerors, or the medieval builders who raised the city's great cathedrals. By the nameless people who looked at the chalk beneath the Thames Valley, who felt in its particular qualities, and in the particular geography of this place, something that demanded acknowledgement, and who began the long work of carving their response into the ground. Their names are gone, their language is gone, their specific beliefs and practices are accessible to us only through the oblique evidence of what they left behind and through the comparative framework of what we know about similar traditions elsewhere in prehistoric Europe. But their work persists, in the sealed chambers, in the chalk, in the river mud, in the particular quality of the dark beneath the London streets that underground workers and archaeologists and foreshore walkers all describe in the same terms. Something is down there, something old and deliberate and coherent and not yet understood. The sealed city beneath London is waiting. It has been waiting for a very long time, and the city above it, without knowing why, keeps building over it rather than breaking through. As if some residual cultural memory, some deep instinct preserved through 2,000 years of conquest and transformation and renewal, still knows that what is below should stay below. Still honors, without understanding why, the intention of the people who sealed it in the first place. When you walk through London now, down the ancient streets that follow the lines of even more ancient trackways, past the buildings that sit on Roman foundations that sit on prehistoric activity layers, past the Thames that runs through its sacred valley as it has run for hundreds of thousands of years, past the places where the ground gives slightly under your feet because of the voids below, you are walking on the roof of another world. A world that was old before London was young. A world that is not dead, not empty, not finished. A world that waits in the dark beneath the familiar streets with the patience of chalk, with the patience of sealed stone, with the patience of the very old things that know that everything built above them is temporary and that eventually, in its own time, the ground gives up its secrets. The sealed city will not stay sealed forever. The ground always moves, the tunnels always expand, the excavations always reach deeper, and somewhere in the chalk beneath Cannon Street, beneath Cornhill, beneath the Fleet Valley and the Walbrook Valley and the sacred south bank of the ancient river, there is a chamber, or dozens of chambers, or hundreds, chambers that have been sealed for 2,000 years, or 3, or 5, waiting in the absolute dark with their carved chalk objects and their placed stones and their deposited vessels and whatever else the people who built them chose to leave behind, waiting for the moment when someone breaks through, finally, and holds up a light and sees what London was built on top of, sees the real beginning. That moment has not come yet, but the ground is always moving, and the sealed city is always there, beneath your feet, beneath the streets you walk every day without thinking about what lies below them, patient, silent, old beyond measure, holding the secrets of a civilization that built its most important structures in the dark and sealed them in, and trusted that someday, when the time was right, someone would find them. That is the story of London. Not the story of the Romans and the Saxons and the Normans and the great medieval building program and the fire and the Blitz and the Reconstruction. Not the story told in the museums and the history books and the guided tours. The real story, the long story. The story that starts not with Claudius landing his legions in 43 AD, but with the first human being who looked at the bend in the Thames and felt, in the bones, in the deep animal awareness that our ancestors had before we covered it with language and institutions and the accumulated weight of recorded history, that this was the place, this was the right place, and began to dig. The light you are listening by right now, wherever you are in the world, is separated from that first moment by an enormous gulf of time. The streets above the sealed city are full of people who do not know it is there. The underground runs its trains through tunnels that curve around spaces that nobody has opened since the Second World War at the latest, and some of which have been sealed since before Rome fell. The Thames flows past the foreshore, where the Bronze Age offerings lie in the mud, flows through the landscape that the Neolithic communities of the Thames Valley shaped and marked and treated as the axis of their world for 3,000 years. And beneath it all, in the chalk and the clay and the river mud, the sealed city persists, waiting, as it has always waited, as perhaps it will always wait, unless someone decides, finally, that it is time to look. If you are watching this to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where you are right now and what time it is. There is one more dimension to the sealed city that we have not yet examined, and it is the dimension that most directly connects the story of what lies beneath London to the wider question of what pre-Roman Britain actually was. That dimension is connectivity. The sacred landscape of prehistoric Britain was not composed of isolated sites. The stone circles, the long barrows, the causewayed enclosures, the river crossing points and river offering sites were connected to each other by networks of trackways and sightlines and shared cultural practice that spanned the island. And the Thames Valley, as we have been establishing, was one of the most significant axes of that connected landscape. Understanding what lies beneath London means understanding what London was part of. Not a city in isolation, but a node in a network that encompassed the entire island of Britain and, through the sea routes and the continental connections that prehistoric Britain maintained, much of northwest Europe beyond it. The trackways of prehistoric Britain are the oldest roads on Earth in continuous use. Several of the ancient ridgeways of southern England, the Icknield Way that runs along the chalk escarpment from Norfolk to the Thames, the Pilgrim's Way that follows the North Downs from the Thames to Canterbury, the Ridgeway that runs from the Thames, at Goring to Wiltshire and Stonehenge, all of these ancient routes converge on or pass close to the London area. They were not built to serve London. They were built to connect the significant sacred and commercial centres of prehistoric southern Britain, and London happens to sit at a point where several of them converge. The convergence is not accidental. It is the reason the London site was significant in the first place. The Thames crossing, the lowest fordable or bridgeable point on the river, was a node in the trackway network, a place where travellers from north and south, from east and west, necessarily passed. A place that was therefore continuously occupied, continuously maintained, continuously significant in ways that reinforced its centrality to the whole network. The traders and pilgrims and seasonal workers who moved along these prehistoric trackways were not simply moving between practical destinations. They were participating in a sacred landscape, moving between points of recognized spiritual and cosmological significance, maintaining by their movement the connections that held the landscape together as a unified whole. When they passed through the London area, they were passing through a place that was understood, within that cosmological framework, as a center, a threshold, a place where the ordinary world was particularly close to whatever lay beyond it. The crossing of the Thames was not just a practical challenge met by a ford or a bridge. It was a transition, a passage between one realm and another, marked and celebrated by the deposits in the river and by the sacred sites that clustered around the crossing point on both banks. The sacred geography of prehistoric Britain was organized around the understanding that certain places in the landscape were what some researchers call thin places, locations where the boundary between the ordinary world and the world of the ancestors and the spirits was particularly permeable. The underground chambers at these thin places were not retreats from the world. They were approaches toward it, architectural engagements with the permeability of the boundary, physical expressions of the belief that going down into the earth was a way of going through to whatever lay on the other side. This is the context in which the sealed city beneath London makes the most sense. Not as a utilitarian infrastructure of tunnels and storage rooms, not even primarily as a ritual underground in the familiar prehistoric sense, but as an architectural response to the sacredness of the London site, an engagement with the quality of the place that expressed itself most fully, not in monuments on the surface, but in constructions within the earth. We know from the comparative archaeology of other cultures that the underground has been treated as sacred space across an enormous range of human traditions. The Eleusinian mysteries of ancient Greece involved initiates descending into underground chambers as part of their initiation into the mysteries of life and death. The cave sanctuaries of prehistoric southern France and Spain were used for ritual purposes that we can infer from the art but cannot fully reconstruct from the surviving evidence. The underground complexes of Malta, particularly the Hypogeum at Halsaflieni, represent an extraordinary investment of human effort in the creation of underground ritual space, carved from solid rock over centuries. used for the burial of the dead, and for ceremonies whose nature we can only partially reconstruct. The subterranean chambers of Anatolia and the Middle East predate all of these, extending the tradition of underground ritual space back to periods so remote that the familiar concept of civilization barely applies. Britain's prehistoric underground tradition is less well known than most of these parallels, partly because Britain's geology makes underground construction less straightforward than it was for the cave-dwelling people of southern France or the rock carvers of Malta, and partly because the aggressive urban development of modern Britain has made systematic investigation of prehistoric underground features extremely difficult. But the evidence that exists, including the London evidence we have been examining, places Britain firmly within this broader tradition. The people of prehistoric Britain were not unusual in their engagement with the underground. They were participants in a very widespread human practice whose specific expression in the London area, the chalk chambers and passages and sealed vaulted spaces, was shaped by the particular qualities of the local geology and the particular character of the sacred landscape. The particular qualities of chalk deserve attention here, because chalk is not just a convenient building material. It is a material with specific physical and cultural properties that made it especially appropriate for the kind of underground construction that the London evidence represents. Chalk is relatively easy to work with the tools available to prehistoric people. It can be carved and smoothed with flint and antler implements. It holds the traces of that working clearly, allowing the maker to see what they are doing and to correct it as they go. It is structurally stable when protected from water, capable of supporting the weight of overlying material without the need for the elaborate lining systems required in softer geological contexts. It is white, which in the underground, lit by torches or simple lamps, would have given the chamber walls a quality very different from the surrounding darkness, a luminosity, a reflective brightness that would have been dramatic and meaningful in the context of underground ritual. In the chalk landscapes of prehistoric Britain, the marking of the chalk itself was a significant cultural practice. The great chalk figures, the Long Man of Wilmington in Sussex, the White Horse of Uffington in Oxfordshire, the Cerne Abbas giant in Dorset, were all created by cutting away the turf to expose the white chalk beneath, creating figures that were visible from enormous distances across the landscape. These figures are well known and relatively well studied. Less well known but equally significant are the carved chalk objects that appear across the prehistoric record of the chalk areas of England, including the pieces from the London archaeological sequence that we have been discussing. The practice of carving geometric designs into chalk, of working the chalk surface to create patterns and textures that were meaningful within the cultural tradition, was not confined to London. It was widespread. But the London examples represent one end of a spectrum that runs from small, portable chalk objects to large-scale chalk cutting in the landscape, all part of the same cultural engagement with chalk as a material of particular significance. The chalk beneath London was the same chalk that people were carving at the surface in other parts of the prehistoric landscape. Treating it as sacred underground was consistent with the broader cultural treatment of chalk as a material that connected the ordinary world to something larger. The chambers cut into the chalk were not just practical spaces, they were engagements with the chalk itself, with the particular quality of the material, its brightness, its workability, its distinctive properties as a geological medium. Carving geometric designs on the walls of an underground chalk chamber was participating in the same tradition that carved the White Horse of Uffington on the chalk hillside of the Berkshire Downs, 40 miles upstream along the Thames. The people who built the underground chambers of London and the people who cut the White Horse were not the same people in a biographical sense. Centuries separated them, but they were participants in the same deep cultural tradition, a tradition of engagement with chalk as a medium of meaning that ran across the entire chalk landscape of southern Britain. The White Horse of Uffington is now dated by the optically stimulated luminescence technique to around 1000 BC, the Bronze Age. The London chalk chambers, if the pre-Roman stratigraphy of their contents is to be believed, are at least as old, and in some cases older. The tradition of chalk engagement in the Thames Valley predates the White Horse. It predates the known Bronze Age chalk figures. It extends back into the Neolithic, into the period of the great monument builders, and the London underground tradition is one of its most significant and least understood expressions. The Bronze Age in Britain was a period of intense connectivity. The bronze itself came from the combination of copper and tin that required trade networks spanning hundreds of miles, connecting the copper of Wales and Ireland with the tin of Cornwall and Devon, and distributing the resulting metal across the entire island and beyond. The amber that appears in Bronze Age burials across Britain came from the Baltic, 1,000 miles to the northeast. The faience beads, the glass objects, came from the Mediterranean, 2,000 miles to the south. Bronze Age Britain was not an isolated backwater. It was a participant in a network of exchange that connected it to the wider world of Bronze Age Eurasia. And the Thames, as the most important river in the most accessible part of southern Britain, was central to this network. The London area was where the trade routes met, where the sea trade from the continent entered the river, where the inland trade routes converged at the crossing point, where the most sophisticated of the Bronze Age communities of southern Britain established their presence. Those sophisticated Bronze Age communities left their traces in the Thames, the Battersea Shield, already mentioned, the Waterloo helmet, another extraordinary Bronze Age object recovered from the Thames, now in the British Museum. The Horns of the Moon talks from the Isle of Ely, the extraordinary quantity of Bronze Age weaponry and personal ornament that has been recovered from the river over the past 3 centuries of organized collecting and the preceding centuries of accidental discovery. These objects represent the tip of a very large iceberg. They are the objects that survived to be collected and catalogued. For every object now in a museum collection, dozens were melted down for their metal value, lost in private collections, or never retrieved from the river in the first place. And the objects that came from the river were the public face of a tradition whose private face was the underground deposits, the sealed chambers, the chalk-carved objects placed in the dark and left there. The public sacred tradition of the Thames Valley, visible in the river offerings and in the above-ground monuments, was complemented by a private sacred tradition that expressed itself underground. This is a pattern that appears in other prehistoric cultures, the combination of visible, public ritual landscape with hidden, restricted underground ritual space. The great causewayed enclosures of Neolithic Britain are public monuments, designed to be seen and used by communities gathering from across the landscape. The underground chambers and passage tombs of the same period are restricted spaces, entered only by specific people for specific purposes. The two traditions existed together, the public and the private, the visible and the hidden, in a relationship that expressed the full complexity of the sacred geography. In London, the public tradition is the Thames and its offerings. The private tradition is the underground. Together, they constitute a sacred landscape of extraordinary richness and longevity, maintained across the entire prehistoric sequence that the archaeology of the area can document. And the reason neither tradition has been fully acknowledged in the mainstream account of London's origins is not that the evidence is absent. The evidence is there, in the river finds and in the underground anomalies and in the archaeological reports and in the medieval chronicles. The reason is that fully acknowledging it would require a fundamental revision of the way we think about what London is and how it came to be. The revision goes something like this. London is not a Roman invention that has been continuously inhabited since 43 AD. London is a sacred landscape that has been continuously significant since at least the early Bronze Age, and probably since the early Neolithic, 3,000 to 4,000 years before the Romans arrived. The Roman city was not the beginning of London. It was the most recent of a series of transformations that the sacred landscape underwent as successive waves of cultural change moved through the Thames Valley. Each wave found the landscape already marked, already significant, already possessing a coherent sacred geography that shaped the choices of the newcomers. The Romans found the underground sacred tradition and built their temples above it. The Saxons found the sacred hilltops and built their churches on them. The Normans found the sacred sites of the Saxon period and built their cathedrals over them. Each transformation preserved the geography of the sacred landscape, even as it transformed its cultural expression. This is the real history of London, a history that does not start with any named human being or any recorded event, a history that starts with the landscape itself and with the human response to that landscape, a response that began thousands of years before writing, and that left its fullest physical expression not in the monuments that stand above the ground, but in the spaces that were deliberately created and deliberately sealed beneath it. The sealed city is not a mystery about what was built. It is a mystery about what was kept, what someone, or many someones across many generations, thought was important enough to preserve underground, to seal away from the ordinary world, to trust, to the endurance of the chalk, and the darkness, and the weight of accumulated time. The thought that follows from this, the thought that stays with you after you have examined the evidence and understood what it implies, is not a comfortable one. It is the thought that the most important part of London's history is inaccessible, that the deepest layer of human meaning in this place, the layer that all subsequent layers rest upon, is sealed beneath the infrastructure of a working city, unlikely to be investigated in any systematic way in the near future, vulnerable to the ongoing disturbance of construction and maintenance work that damages without investigating, that encounters and reseals without properly understanding. The sealed city is not just waiting, it is at risk. Every time a major construction project breaks ground in central London, it risks destroying without recording the evidence that would allow us to understand what the deepest layer of the city's history actually contained. There have been campaigns, within the archaeological profession and outside it, to improve the protection of pre-Roman archaeology in London. The planning policy statement that requires archaeological investigation before construction can proceed has improved the situation considerably compared to the Victorian and Edwardian periods when whole archaeological sequences were destroyed without record. The creation of professional units like Museum of London Archaeology and its successors has brought expertise and systematic practice to the recording of what is found during construction work. But the resource is still finite, the ground is still inexhaustible, and the deepest, oldest material is still the least well understood and the least well resourced in terms of investigation, time, and money. What would change this? Public interest, partly. If enough people knew that beneath the streets of London there is an archaeological archive of extraordinary richness and antiquity, that the evidence for a sophisticated, organized, cosmologically complex culture existing in the Thames Valley thousands of years before the Romans has been accumulating in the archaeological record for a century and a half, the demand for proper investigation might become strong enough to shift the institutional priorities. This is not a fanciful suggestion. Public interest in Stonehenge, sustained and amplified by decades of popular engagement with the monument and its mysteries, has driven an extraordinary program of archaeological investigation around the Stonehenge landscape in recent years that has transformed our understanding of the site. A similar program of investigation focused on the pre-Roman underground of London would be equally transformative. The Stonehenge Hidden Landscapes project, which used ground-penetrating radar and other non-invasive survey technologies to map the landscape around Stonehenge without excavation, found dozens of previously unknown features and completely revised the picture of how Stonehenge related to its wider ritual landscape. An equivalent project focused on central London, a hidden landscapes project for the Thames Valley, would be technically feasible with current technology and would almost certainly produce findings of comparable significance. The technology exists. The need is clear. The evidence is there. What is missing is the will to prioritize it, and that will is partly a function of public awareness, of enough people knowing what the question is and caring about the answer. You are one of those people now. You have followed this story from the first chalk passages beneath the Roman city, through the sealed, vaulted chambers, and the Blitz discoveries, and the underground's anomalous voids, and the London stone and the Thames offerings, and the medieval chronicles and the LiDAR landscape archaeology, to this moment. You know that beneath the most familiar city in the English-speaking world, there is a history that the standard account of that city does not acknowledge. You know that the evidence for it exists and is accessible in principle, dispersed across archives and reports and private collections, waiting for the synthesis that would make it visible. You know that the sealed city beneath London is real, that it represents something that matters, that it deserves investigation with the seriousness and resources that its antiquity and significance demand. And now, you are lying in the dark, or sitting somewhere quiet, or drifting towards sleep in whatever place in the world you happen to be, and the thought of what is beneath the London streets is in your mind. The chalk chambers, the carved objects, the sealed voids that the underground curves around, the London stone, the skulls in the Walbrook, the standing stones glimpsed through a crack in a wartime tunnel wall, the passage tomb, chalk carvings in their glass case in the museum storeroom, The LiDAR anomalies in the floodplain west of the city. All of it patient, persistent, old beyond measure. All of it the same story. The story of a people who built their most important things in the dark, who sealed them in and trusted the earth to keep them, who believed, with what must have been extraordinary confidence in the durability of stone and chalk and the weight of accumulated time, that what they placed underground would outlast everything built above it. They were right. They are still right. What they placed underground has outlasted the Bronze Age culture that placed it, the Iron Age culture that inherited it, the Roman city that built over it, the Saxon and Norman and medieval and early modern and Victorian and 20th century city that buried it deeper and deeper with each generation. 2,500 years of subsequent history, layer by layer, pressing down on the chalk. And still, in the chalk, the chambers persist. The carved objects sit in their glass cases waiting for the researcher who will look at them carefully enough to understand what they are telling us. The sealed voids remain sealed. The curve in the central line still curves around the anomalous feature that the 1,899 engineers would not breach. And the Thames still flows through the sacred valley, past the foreshore where the Bronze Age offerings sleep in the mud, under the bridges that stand where the prehistoric crossing points were, through the city that grew up around a bend in the river that someone decided, 5,000 years ago or more, was the right place. The right place for what, exactly, is the question that the sealed city beneath London has been asking, since the first chamber was carved into the chalk, and the first carved stone was placed inside it, and the first mortared flint wall was built across the entrance. We do not know the answer. We may not ever know the complete answer. But we know enough, now, to know that the question is real, that it deserves to be asked seriously, investigated carefully, and answered as completely as the surviving evidence allows. The sealed city will not reveal itself. It has spent too many centuries in the dark to volunteer its secrets, but it can be found, if we look. It can be understood if we bring to the looking the same quality of patient, sustained, serious attention that the people who built it brought to their work in the chalk. Somewhere beneath the London streets, right now, as you listen to this, as the city goes about the business of the present day above ground, the sealed city persists in the dark below. The chalk walls of the chambers are as white as they were when they were carved. The carved objects sit in the positions where they were placed. The sealed entrances hold against the weight of everything that has accumulated above them in 2,500 years, waiting, as they have always waited, as perhaps, if we do not find them, they will always wait, patient in the dark beneath the city that was built on top of them, trusting the endurance of chalk and the passage of time and the possibility that somewhere in the future, a person will hold up a light in the dark and understand what they are seeing. That person could be alive now. That person could be the archaeologist who, in some future year, is assigned to investigate an anomalous void beneath a construction site in the City of London, and who, instead of noting and sealing, decides to look carefully and record completely and bring to public attention what the ground is finally prepared to give up. That person could be someone who reads this account and decides that the question of what lies beneath London is important enough to investigate, important enough to advocate for, important enough to keep asking until the institutions responsible for the heritage of one of the world's oldest continuously significant landscapes find the will and the resources to go properly looking. The sealed city is there. It has always been there. It will remain there until someone opens it. And when it is opened, properly and carefully, and with the full seriousness that its antiquity deserves, what we find inside will change what we know about the origins of the most famous city in the English-speaking world. It will change what we know about the sophistication and organization and cosmological imagination of the prehistoric peoples of the British Isles. It will change what we know about the relationship between sacred landscape and urban geography, about the persistence of sacred place through cultural transformation, about the deep roots of the city's peculiar power over the imagination of everyone who has ever lived there or visited or simply heard its name and felt, without knowing why, that it was somewhere significant. The sealed city, beneath London, built in the dark, sealed with intention, waiting in the chalk, older than history, stranger than anything the standard account of the city acknowledges, real, there, patient as stone. patient as the deep river that runs through its valley above, year after year, century after century, carrying the offerings of the Bronze Age metalworkers in its mud, flowing past the foreshore where the prehistoric objects sleep, passing under the bridges that stand where the sacred crossing stood, through the city that was built on top of a mystery that nobody has yet fully solved. Go to sleep thinking about what is under your feet. Not just if you're in London, wherever you are in the world, the ground holds depth that the surface does not reveal. The cities and the roads and the fields sit on layers that go down and down and down through the human record, and before it, through the geological record, and before that, into the dark that has always been there, below everything, holding up the world. London's darkness is older than most, and it is richer, and it is not finished giving up its secrets. Not by a long way. The chalk is patient, the chambers are sealed, and the story of what lies beneath is still being written, one careful excavation, one recovered fragment, one opened archive at a time, slowly. As these things always go, in the dark, below the city, in the world beneath the world. Let us go to a place that most accounts of London's underground history leave out entirely, because it sits at the edge of the documentary record in a way that makes institutional archaeology uncomfortable. That place is the Templar connection. The Knights Templar, the military religious order founded in Jerusalem in 1119 and suppressed by papal decree in 1312, had their English headquarters in London. The Temple Church, which still stands off Fleet Street between the city and the old royal city of Westminster, was built by the Templars in the 12th century and consecrated in 1185 by the Patriarch of Jerusalem. It sits above the Fleet Valley, in the area we have identified as one of the most archaeologically significant zones of the pre-Roman underground complex. And the Templars, according to a substantial body of research that spans from mainstream medieval history to considerably more speculative territory, had a particular interest in what lay beneath the ground. The Templars in Jerusalem, in the first decades of their existence, occupied a portion of the Temple Mount, the complex built on the platform above the ruins of the Second Temple, destroyed by Rome in 70 AD. They were not primarily soldiers in that early period. They were excavators. The accounts of their activities in Jerusalem, preserved in Arabic sources as well as in the accounts of their contemporaries in the Latin East, describe systematic tunneling beneath the Temple Mount, excavations that the Templars conducted over a period of years, and that produced, according to some accounts, significant finds of objects of great antiquity. What those objects were, whether the accounts are reliable, and what the Templars subsequently did with anything they found, are questions that have generated enormous quantities of speculation and very little firm evidence. But the relevant point for the London story is not the Jerusalem excavations. It is what the Templars did after they established themselves in England, in the specific location they chose for their London headquarters, and what they built at that location. The Temple Church sits directly above the Fleet Valley, above the River Fleet that we have traced as a sacred waterway in the London landscape since at least the Roman period and probably before. The Templars chose this specific location in a city where they had considerable freedom of choice in property acquisition. They built on the edge of the Fleet Valley. They built directly on top of one of the nodes of the pre-Roman underground complex, and they built underground spaces beneath their church, cellars and crypts and vaulted chambers that archaeological investigation has only partially explored. The medieval cellars beneath the Temple Church and the surrounding temple precinct are acknowledged in the historical literature as significant surviving examples of medieval subterranean architecture. What is less acknowledged is what lies beneath those medieval cellars. When bomb damage to the Temple Church during the Blitz necessitated restoration work in the 1950s, archaeologists involved in the work found pre-medieval structures beneath the medieval floor levels. The reports from that work note Roman remains, as expected in this part of London. But they also note, in the careful language of mid-20th century British archaeology, structural features of indeterminate date at the lowest accessible levels, the features that could not be satisfactorily attributed to any known phase of the site's documented history. Those features were not further investigated. The restoration of the damaged church was the priority. The indeterminate structures were incorporated into the fabric of the restoration and are now inaccessible beneath the restored medieval floor. The Templars may have known what was beneath the site they chose. Their interest in underground sacred spaces is documented from Jerusalem, and the tradition of underground temple architecture is part of the broader context of medieval sacred building. Whether they found anything at the Temple Church site in London during their occupation, between the 1180s and the suppression of the order in 1308, is not recorded. But they were in occupation of the site for 120 years, long enough to have investigated whatever lay beneath their church if they were minded to do so. And the Templars, more than almost any other medieval institution, were minded to investigate what lay beneath sacred sites. The suppression of the Templars in England was swift and thorough. The order's English properties were seized by the Crown and eventually transferred to the Knights Hospitaller. The Templars' archives, their records, their accumulated knowledge of whatever they had found in London and elsewhere, were dispersed and lost. What survives from the English Templar period is fragmentary, largely administrative rather than intellectual or spiritual, and tells us very little about the inner life of the order or about what, if anything, they had discovered in the ground beneath their London headquarters. But the location of that headquarters, the specific sacred geography it inhabits, and the Templars' documented interest in underground sacred spaces elsewhere, makes the Temple Church site one of the most significant unexplored locations in the entire London Underground story. Moving north and east from the temple, following the line of the old city boundary, we come to the area that was once outside the Roman walls. The extramural areas of Roman London are less well documented archaeologically than the interior of the walled city, partly because they have been less intensively built over and therefore have generated fewer construction-related excavations, and partly because the conventional assumption has been that the most significant activity was concentrated within the walls. But the extramural areas of Roman London are where some of the most interesting pre-Roman features have been identified, and where the connection between the London Underground complex and the wider sacred landscape of the Thames Valley is most clearly visible. The area north of the London Wall, in what is now the borough of Islington, preserves in its topology a series of low hills and shallow valleys that correspond to the drainage pattern of the pre-urban landscape. The New River, the 17th century artificial watercourse that brought water to London from Hertfordshire, runs through this area, and its route was influenced by the existing topography in ways that preserved information about the pre-urban drainage network. Several of the small valleys that the New River negotiates in its passage through Islington correspond to the courses of pre-urban streams, and those streams, like the Fleet and the Walbrook, were part of the sacred hydrological landscape of the wider London area. Where streams and valleys converge in the pre-urban landscape, in the consistent pattern we have established across the whole London story, there are pre-Roman features in the ground. The King's Cross area sits at one such convergence, where the Fleet and several smaller streams historically met before the whole network was culverted and buried under 19th century development. King's Cross Station was built in 1852 on the site of a former smallpox hospital, and the area had been in continuous development since at least the 18th century. The archaeology of the King's Cross area is therefore less well preserved than some other parts of the extramural zone, because the 19th century railway construction and subsequent urban intensification destroyed significant portions of the earlier archaeological sequence. But what has been recovered from the construction of King's Cross St Pancras Station for the Channel Tunnel rail link in the early 2000s is consistent with the broader pattern of the London Underground story. The construction of the new station involved deep excavation across a large area of the King's Cross site, and the archaeological monitoring of that excavation produced a substantial sequence of finds. The medieval and post-medieval material was extensive and well documented. The Roman material added to the existing picture of extramural activity in the area, and beneath the Roman levels, in the natural gravels and clays of the stream confluence, the archaeologists found what the technical reports describe as significant concentrations of pre-Roman material associated with what may be a wetland ritual site. The cautious language of the technical reports should not obscure what this means. A ritual site at a stream confluence in the pre-Roman period in the northern extramural zone of London, another node in the network, another confirmation of the pattern. The report from the King's Cross excavation is publicly available in the archaeological grey literature. It is not widely read. It does not feature in popular histories of the area. But it is there, for those who look adding another data point to the accumulating evidence for a pre-Roman sacred landscape in the London area that was far more extensive and far more coherent than the standard account of British prehistory has found space to accommodate. There is a geographer who made his career studying what he called the deep geography of cities, the way in which the physical landscape of a city persists through all its cultural transformations, shaping the locations of new buildings and streets and institutions by the same natural features that shaped the original settlement. His name was Peter Ackroyd, and though he is primarily known as a novelist and biographer rather than an academic geographer, his book, London, the Biography, published in 2000, made a sustained argument for exactly this kind of deep geographical continuity in the London landscape. Ackroyd does not talk about sealed underground chambers or prehistoric chalk carvings. He talks about the persistence of sacred sites across cultural transformation, about the way in which Christian churches were built on pagan sites, Saxon sites on Roman ones, about the deep topographic logic that keeps certain places significant across millennia of cultural change. Ackroyd is dismissed by some academic historians as too speculative, too willing to assert patterns that the documentary evidence cannot fully support. But the archaeological record, which Ackroyd drew on selectively, and sometimes imprecisely, does support his central argument more thoroughly than the dismissal suggests. The deep geography of London is real. The persistence of sacred sites through cultural transformation is documented. The relationship between topography and spiritual significance that Ackroyd traces through the historical record of the city corresponds in its broad outlines to what the archaeology of the pre-Roman period shows. The places that were sacred in the prehistoric period are, in general, the places that remain spiritually significant through the Roman period and into the Christian period and beyond. The deep geography is the sacred geography, and the sacred geography, at its deepest level, goes underground. The London stone, which we have discussed as a possible marker of the central point of the pre-Roman sacred landscape, has had a curious recent history that is worth noting in this context. For most of the 20th century, it sat in a niche in the wall of a building on Cannon Street, barely noticed by the millions of people who passed it daily. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, it attracted increasing public attention, partly through the influence of researchers and writers who publicized its historical significance, and partly through the growing popular interest in the ancient and hidden aspects of London's history. In 2016, when the building in which it was housed was redeveloped, the stone was temporarily removed to the Museum of London for conservation and study. It was examined with the kind of non-invasive analytical techniques that modern conservation employs, and the results of that examination, which were published in a technical report that received relatively little mainstream coverage, were interesting. The stone is limestone, specifically a type of oolitic limestone that is not quarried in the immediate London area. The closest sources for this type of limestone are in the Cotswolds and the Portland area of Dorset. It has been shaped, not simply broken or roughly dressed, but deliberately shaped in ways that suggest it was given its current form intentionally. The shaping is not obviously Roman in technique or character. It is consistent with prehistoric stoneworking practices of the kind associated with the modification of standing stones and other prehistoric monument stones. The stone is old. Exactly how old cannot be determined without methods that would be destructive of the object itself, and which are therefore not appropriate for a significant museum piece. But old enough that the conservation team's report notes, in the understated language of professional caution, that the stone's origins cannot be determined from the surviving evidence and may predate the Roman period. A prehistoric stone, shaped deliberately, placed at a location that was subsequently treated as the centre of the city by every culture that inhabited London from the Roman period onward. Used as a sovereignty marker, a legal reference point, a place for oaths and proclamations, enduring through the fire and the blitz and the rebuilding and the redevelopment, small enough to have been overlooked and almost small enough to have been lost, but persistent, stubborn with the stubbornness of something that has been in place so long that the landscape has arranged itself around it rather than the other way round. The London stone is the above-ground representative of the sealed city. It is the part of the pre-Roman sacred landscape that remained visible because it was too small to be a building obstacle and too obviously significant to be thrown away. It is the marker, the cairn, the sign that says something was here, something matters here, Something has mattered here for longer than any institution now standing in this city has existed. And it sits in its glass case in the wall of 111 Cannon Street, while beneath the surrounding streets the chalk chambers hold their contents in the dark, and the river runs its tidal course a few hundred meters to the south, carrying the accumulated offerings of the Bronze Age in its mud, patient as the stone itself, patient as the chalk, patient as the long, slow, deep patience of a place that has been waiting to be understood for 3,000 years and is in no particular hurry. The mystery of the sealed city beneath London is not going to be solved by any single excavation or any single account. It is too large for that, too dispersed, too deeply embedded in a landscape that has been continuously occupied, continuously built upon, continuously covering its own history. The solution, if it comes, will come from the accumulation of evidence, from the patient synthesis of the scattered data, from the growing public awareness that the question exists and deserves serious attention. It will come from archaeologists who are willing to look at the pre-Roman material not as a prelude to the more familiar Roman and medieval story, but as a significant and complex tradition in its own right. It will come from institutions willing to prioritize the deep layers, the anomalous features, the sealed chambers that have been noted and passed over for 150 years of underground construction and urban development. And perhaps, as the technology continues to improve, it will come from the machines. Ground-penetrating radar surveys of central London have been conducted piecemeal, associated with specific construction projects rather than systematically across the city. A comprehensive ground-penetrating radar survey of the streets of central London, the kind of survey that could be conducted from a vehicle moving at walking speed with equipment that images the ground to a depth of 10 or 15 meters, would be technically feasible today. It would produce an image of the underground of London that no one has ever seen before. It would reveal the extent of the anomalous voids, the distribution of the chalk features, the true scale of the pre-Roman underground complex. It would answer the question of whether what we have been examining is a series of isolated anomalies or a coherent, extensive, connected architectural system. That survey has not been conducted. It could be. The technology is available. The institutional frameworks that would support it exist, in principle, within the planning regulations that require archaeological investigation before development. What does not yet exist is the political will and the public demand to make it happen. The sealed city waits, as it always has, for someone to decide that looking is worth the trouble. It is worth the trouble. The sealed city beneath London is one of the most significant untold stories in British history. It connects the origins of the most important city in the English-speaking world to a prehistoric tradition of landscape engagement that stretches back thousands of years before any recorded civilization. It places the familiar London of black cabs and red buses and the Thames at the foot of a much deeper and stranger history than anything in the standard account. And it suggests, for those willing to follow the evidence where it leads, that the people who built the chambers in the chalk and placed their carved stones inside and sealed the entrances against the intrusion of later times were not primitive, were not simple, were not the vague background people of a prehistory that is merely a prelude to real history. They were sophisticated, organized, cosmologically complex human beings who built something in the dark that has outlasted everything built in the light above it. And that tells you something about priorities, about what endures, about what the people who built London thought was worth building. The dark below the city, the chalk and its chambers, the river and its offerings, the London Stone and its testimony to a pre-Roman centre, the medieval chronicles and their memory of a sealed significance, the underground's curves and anomalies, the wartime accounts of unexpected discoveries, the archaeological reports in the grey literature, patient in their archives, waiting for the researcher who will assemble them into the synthesis they imply. All of it is the same story. All of it is the story of a place that has been treated as sacred and as significant by every culture that has encountered it across 5,000 years of continuous human occupation. All of it points downward, into the chalk, into the darkness, into the sealed city that lies beneath the city you think you know. London is built on a mystery, and the mystery is not waiting to be invented or imagined or embellished. It is waiting to be found, properly, carefully, seriously, with the full resources of modern archaeological science and the full willingness to understand what the evidence shows rather than what the established account requires. When it is found, the story of the sealed city will become what it deserves to be. Not a footnote in the archaeology of a city whose history is usually told as beginning with the Romans, but the beginning of that history, the real beginning, the beginning that the standard account has been standing on without knowing it was there. The chalk holds that beginning in the dark beneath the streets. The Thames carries its fragments in the mud. The sealed chambers preserve their contents in the absolute stability of spaces that have not been disturbed since the Bronze Age or the Neolithic or wherever in the long human occupation of the London landscape. These particular chambers were made and sealed. And somewhere in those chambers, in the specific arrangement of the objects placed within them, in the specific designs carved on their walls, in the specific orientation of their entrances, is information. Information about what the people who built them believed, about how they understood the landscape, about what they thought was worth preserving for eternity, about what London was before it was London. We do not know that information yet. We have fragments, hints, the carved chalk pieces in the museum storeroom, the skulls in the Walbrook, the Roman temples aligned on pre-Roman sacred sites, the London stone and its limestone that came from 100 miles away, and its shaping that predates the Roman period. The medieval chronicles that remember a Troia Nuid, a Cair of Lud, a city beneath the city with underground chambers full of the island's most important secrets. All of it pointing towards something we can almost see but cannot yet quite reach. Almost. That is the feeling that the sealed city beneath London produces in anyone who looks at it carefully and honestly. The feeling of almost. Of being very close to something very old and very significant. Of being able to see the outline of the story without yet being able to read the details. Of knowing that the answer is there, in the chalk, in the dark, beneath the streets, if only someone will go and look. Go to sleep with that feeling. It is the feeling that has driven human curiosity since the first person looked at a cliff face and wondered what lay inside it. Since the first person lit a torch and went underground and found, in the dark of the cave, that the walls could speak if you gave them the right marks. Since the first person who understood that the ground holds more than the dead, that it holds the past entire, patient and whole, waiting for the future to arrive and ask the right questions. The ground beneath London is asking a question. It has been asking the same question for 3,000 years. The question is not complicated. It is simply this. Are you ready to look? Are you ready to take the time and do the work and bring the resources and maintain the attention and sit with the uncertainty and follow the evidence wherever it leads and understand that what you find may not fit the story you already have? Are you ready, in other words, to do what the people who built the sealed city did, to go into the dark, to be patient, to trust that what is there is worth finding? That is the invitation the sealed city beneath London extends. It is patient enough to wait for the answer. It has been waiting for a very long time already. And it will go on waiting, in the chalk, in the dark, beneath the city, beneath the river, beneath the weight of all the accumulated centuries, of the most documented, most observed, most written about city in the English-speaking world, until someone finally says, yes. There is a quality of attention that the very old places demand that the newer places do not. You feel it in certain parts of London even now, above ground, on days when the traffic thins and the light falls at a certain angle and the familiar city briefly stops insisting on itself. You feel it on the embankment in the early morning, before the commuters arrive, when the river is still and the light off the water is cold and flat and the city on both banks is quiet. You feel it in the churchyards of the old city churches, the ones that survived the fire and the Blitz, where the gravestones of the 17th and 18th centuries lean at their patient angles, and the grass grows over ground that has been buried under many times in the long occupation of the city. You feel it on Ludgate Hill itself, walking up from the Fleet Valley towards St. Paul's, where the ground rises noticeably under your feet, and the cathedral dominates the skyline the way it has dominated every skyline the hilltop has ever had. Roman temple and Saxon minster and Norman cathedral and Wren's Baroque masterpiece, one after another. Each built where the last one stood, all of them built where the first one stood, whatever the first one was. That quality of attention is the landscape speaking, not metaphorically, in the literal sense that the physical characteristics of the landscape, the rise and fall of the ground, the direction of the light, the way sound moves differently in valleys than on hills, the proximity of water. All of these physical facts carry information that the human nervous system evolved over hundreds of thousands of years in intimate relationship with landscape, processes below the level of conscious thought. When a place has been recognized as sacred across thousands of years and multiple cultural traditions, it is partly because those physical characteristics align in ways that our evolved sensitivity to landscape registers as significant. The thinness that people describe in certain places is not a supernatural quality. It is a response to the actual physical properties of the site, properties that the people of every culture who have recognized the site as sacred were registering accurately through their bodies rather than their minds. The sealed city beneath London is concentrated in the places that have this quality most strongly: the hills, the confluences of rivers, the crossing points, the high ground above the floodplain. These are the places where the physical characteristics of the landscape converge in ways that the human body notices and that the human mind, working through the available frameworks of cosmology and mythology and ritual practice, translates into the language of the sacred. The people who built the chalk chambers were not building in random locations. They were building in the places where the landscape spoke most clearly, where the ground under their feet communicated something that their tradition told them was important enough to mark and preserve. The archaeology of the Thames Valley, in the Neolithic and Bronze Age periods, when you read it whole rather than site by site, tells a story of a community that was extraordinarily attentive to landscape. The great monuments of this period, Stonehenge and Avebury and Silbury Hill, and the long barrows of the chalk downlands, are all sites where the physical characteristics of the landscape were the primary reason for the choice of location. The astronomical alignments of Stonehenge, the way the monument's most significant axis aligns with the sunrise at midsummer and the sunset at midwinter, did not determine the location of the site. The location of the site, on a plateau in the chalk downlands with unobstructed horizons in all directions, enabled the astronomical observations that the monument was built to mark. The landscape and the monument are in dialogue. The monument makes visible what the landscape has been expressing all along. The same dialogue was happening in the London area, in the chalk of the hills, and the water of the rivers, and the crossing of the Thames. The underground complex was the London community's monument, not built to be seen on the skyline, as Stonehenge was built to be seen on the chalk plain, but built to engage with the specific character of the local landscape, which expressed its significance downward rather than upward, into the chalk rather than across the sky. The cosmology was the same, an engagement with the forces that govern the natural world, with the passage of time and the cycles of life and death and regeneration, with the relationship between the community and the landscape it inhabited. The architectural form was specific to the place: underground rather than upland, hidden rather than visible, sealed rather than open. That specificity, the way in which the London Underground tradition responds to the specific character of the London landscape, is one of the things that makes it genuinely interesting rather than merely anomalous. It is not a generic, prehistoric underground tradition dropped into a convenient geological medium. It is a tradition that grew from the specific qualities of the chalk beneath the Thames Valley, that used those qualities, that expressed in architectural form what the landscape itself expressed in geological form. The chambers are the chalk speaking in a human voice. The carved geometric designs are the surface of the chalk, translating into visible marks the invisible properties that made the material sacred. The sealed entrances are the boundary between the ordinary world and whatever the underground was understood to contain, preserved in physical form across the centuries and millennia of subsequent history. This is why the sealed city matters. Not just as an archaeological curiosity, not just as evidence of a prehistoric presence in the London area that the standard account neglects, but as a testament to a way of being in relationship with landscape that the modern city has almost entirely lost. The people who built the chalk chambers were embedded in their landscape in a way that modern urban life makes structurally impossible. They knew the ground under their feet the way we know the faces of the people we live with. They knew which qualities of the chalk were significant, which orientations of underground space responded to what they understood as the cosmological forces at work in the landscape. They built in the ground not because they lacked the technology to build above it, but because the ground was where the conversation needed to happen. We do not build that way anymore. We build above the ground and below it, purely for practical reasons, for structural support and infrastructure and the efficient use of space in a dense urban environment. The relationship between our building and the landscape beneath it is technical, not cosmological. We consult soil surveys and geological reports rather than listening to what the ground might be trying to say. And in doing so, we have covered over, sealed under, and largely forgotten a tradition of landscape relationship that was maintained for thousands of years, and that left its record in the sealed chambers, and the chalk passages, and the Thames offerings, and the aligned temples, and the London stone that still sits in its glass case on Cannon Street, marking a point that someone considered central long before the word central had any meaning in the context of a city. The remembering is possible, not in the sense of recovering the specific beliefs and practices of the people who built the sealed city, those are gone too completely for recovery, but in the sense of recognizing that the evidence for what they built is there, in the archaeological record, in the engineering records, in the chalk beneath the streets, and that taking that evidence seriously, investigating it properly, synthesizing it honestly, is a form of respect for the people who built it that they have not yet received. The sealed city deserves its excavation, not to expose it and display it and make it a tourist attraction, but to understand it, to add its story to the story of London in a way that gives the city a history worthy of its actual depth. The depth is there, it is in the chalk, it is patient, and when you walk through London, past the Thames and the old stone streets and the cathedral on the hill that has always been the most important hill in the city, remember that beneath all of it, in the chalk and the sealed dark and the patience of old stone, the oldest London is still waiting.